Dante Alighieri really was thinking 10 steps ahead when he split hell into 9 distinct themed levels full of an abundantly recognisable and charming cast of characters, and an immense, impressive final boss. R.I.P. buddy, you would have loved Astrobot. Never before has history provided such an adaptable story, and Visceral Games, creators of Dead Space, merely had to take each of the 9 levels and slap them all out into a game to have a passable experience at the ready, home in time for dinner. Did they do that? No. Not one to do it by halves, Visceral put their hearts and souls into adapting one of the greatest epic tales of all time. Using the poem as a jumping off point, Visceral produced something of such depth and creativity that I fear we may never see a AAA game with such brilliance again. Trapped forever on the PS3 and Xbox 360, Dante's Inferno is arguably out of reach for the player of today, and that sucks. It's one of my favourites of all time, and today I'm going to tell you why. Now, Inferno and Dante's Inferno, and Dante, soldier, poet, and writer respectively, are going to be very confusing to differentiate between. So we'll do it like this. The Divine Comedy contains Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I will refer to the character in these poems as fictional poem Dante. I will refer to the writer of these poems as real Dante, or Dante Alighieri. The game is titled Dante's Inferno, with a protagonist I will refer to as Game Dante. I will make it make as much sense as I possibly can. I know Game Dante and fictional poet Dante are both fictional poets technically, but I tried a version of this script where I called him Poem Dante and my editor politely asked me to stop. It was too confusing. For the history buffs among you, this video will not feature a deep dive into every character and event referenced in Inferno. There are loads. I've done my best to be accurate, and where I wasn't sure, I've tried to make clear that my info is incomplete, or it's my personal opinion. If you'd like to add anything, please write to your heart's content in the comments. Tell me your favourite damned soul, and which layer of hell you'd go to, and why. Now, without further ado, let's talk about why I will call off the drones if Dante's Inferno gets the re-release it deserves. If you want to get straight to the game, use the chapter select below to get straight to Limbo. Otherwise, there are a few cool bits I'd like to talk about first. I imagine it's rare to see a sponsor segment that only lasts 20 seconds. Now, what if I told you you'll be done in half that time with Adam and Eve? Adam and Eve. Use discount code MERD for 50% off one item and free shipping at adamandeve.com. Visceral took significant creative license with both poem and poet when adapting the Divine Comedy for their game. Game Dante is not the willowy wanderer fictional Dante is. He's a ripped, muscle-bound soldier, a man of war who served in the Third Crusade in 1191 under the rule of King Richard, well-versed in combat and a seasoned warrior. Although real Dante had himself been a soldier, that's not what he was known for, and not something he ever makes explicit reference to in the Divine Comedy. Real Dante wrote Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso across a span of 12 years after his exile from his hometown, an exile that occurred following a turf war, so to speak, that his religious faction lost. He was supremely bitter about this development, a fact you'll find obvious with even a cursory glance at the allegories in Inferno. From the dark forest he wanders in, lost at the midpoint of his life, to the political and religious opponents he gleefully inserts into hell off the back of his own mortal judgment, to even the abstract comments made about earthly sin, he's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He tries to frame his worldview as the worldview, adding these details as though they're a fact of reality and not the symptoms of his anger, but honestly, I get it. I once got booted off a project at work because the project manager invited me back to his hotel at the Christmas party and I said, no thanks, and I can guarantee I'd find a way to worm him into whichever hell I was writing too. With that, however, we must acknowledge real Dante's pride. Pride is the one sin fictional Dante made sure to tarnish his character with, but it's also so embedded into his writing that, while fictional Dante overcomes his pride, real Dante clearly suffers from it all the way through to publication. He actually feels like he gets more prideful across the poem, if you can believe it. Dante's pride manifests in interesting ways. Fictional Dante begins Inferno extremely sympathetic to all the trapped souls in hell. He feels so sorry for them that he occasionally faints from the intensity of his emotion, albeit this is more a way to facilitate travel between layers of hell. He'll basically faint on one level and wake up on the next, eliminating any need to write like 2 lines about how he dropped down there. Work smart, not hard, I guess, Dante. Fictional Dante's empathy is bizarrely the perceived source of his pride. As Inferno goes on, Dante learns to basically let go of his own judgments of God's judgment. He stops looking at these people with pity, getting torn to shreds by huge wolves all day, lying in shit for the rest of time, and starts to look at them like, I have no say in this, you're here because God said you should be here, and if he wills it, then it's for the best, and I won't question it. In this way, Dante's pride, so to speak, is cured, so to speak. And yet, real Dante's pride is abundant as balls. Real Dante spends a lot of time, for lack of a better term, sucking himself off throughout this poem. Imagine if your mate wrote a story about meeting Aristotle, and Aristotle being like, wow, you are so clever that I want to be your best friend right now. You should come and hang out with us. You should join the club. You'd be a bit like, right, that's what real Dante did. He meets Homer, Socrates, Plato, Caesar, Hippocrates, and many more, like 30 people in Limbo alone, and he's welcomed in like an old friend. These scenes are cut entirely from the game because A, game Dante is more brawn than brain, so these scenes would make no sense, and B, it would destroy any tempo the story managed to build, so it's for the best. That said, real Dante went down in history with one of the most famous and enduring legacies known to mankind, still going strong after 700 plus years, having written one of the most famous stories in humanity's history, so maybe he was right to toot his own horn so desperately. That's not the only way real Dante's pride manifested, however. Not to be that guy, but real Dante did not enter a black forest, get waylaid by a vicious she-wolf, end up traversing hell, the earthly mountain of purgatory, and the spheres of heaven, and meet God. He just didn't. The story is heavily allegorical, obviously, but it's also a story. Inferno is like proto-horror. It's entertainment. He wrote it in the common vernacular, Italian, instead of Latin, because he wanted people to read it. And in order to write fiction about God, he needed to decide what God was going to be like. He needed to write rules for his world. He mapped out the layers of hell and dictated the nature of each layer's contrapasso, i.e. each layer's punishment, which was tailored specifically to fit the crime. He wrote the rules of hell itself, and that is, if nothing else, pride incarnate. Fictional Dante coming to understand that everything he sees is God's will, and therefore divinely perfect, isn't so much a deference to the Almighty as it is to himself, the creator of this fictional world. On the other hand, game Dante and Dante's Inferno as a whole takes an alternative, albeit implicit, reading of Inferno, and the attitudes of fictional Dante's God. Dante's Inferno is, to me, a critique of the original poem. It's a piece of work that, over 700 years later, seeks to strip back the logic presented by fictional Dante and expose it for all its inconsistencies and cruelties, while simultaneously paying homage to its creativity. I think that, whilst being an exceptionally adapted piece of work, Dante's Inferno challenges Inferno's depictions of hell and God, especially God, who comes out the other end as a malicious torturer. Both game Dante and fictional Dante meet the couple Paolo Malatesta and Francesca da Rimini when traversing the lust circle of hell. Francesca was married to Paolo's brother Giovanni. In the poem, we are told they fell in love and initially resisted their urges. One day, upon reading the extremely sultry story of Lancelot and Guinevere, they kissed and began an affair. When Giovanni discovered their affair, he murdered them both. In the game, we learn that Francesca, titled in-game as Francesca da Polenta, had been forced into an arranged marriage with the much older Giovanni Malatesta, who she never loved. In fact, during the actual ceremony, Paolo stood in for Giovanni as a proxy groom because Giovanni was handicapped and could not physically attend his own wedding. Francesca and Paolo fell in love with each other at this moment. Francesca's shade will scream things like, "Father, please do not give me away." An entirely different picture of this woman's life is painted through subtle details that fictional Dante neglects. Dante's Inferno places even its most unsympathetic souls in positions of pity, and these lovers are the best example of people spurned by the poem. Most of the details of their tale are omitted so as to paint them as filthy adulterers, no matter how much fictional Dante faints at their story. Cheating is bad on paper, yes, but this girl was essentially offered as a bribe to keep peace in her city, married to a man she vehemently opposed marrying. Signing your life away on paper is one thing, but placing her in hell for this is another thing entirely, and Dante's Inferno makes that pretty clear. To imagine this couple still atoning for their 10-year affair in 30,000 years' time, so long in the future that they probably no longer even remember their own names, is hardly just. It's not a fitting punishment. And that's the thing, because hell is just as divine as heaven and purgatory. It sits in the penumbra cast by them both. Just because hell is a place where those unwanted by God go, doesn't mean it's not a place created by God for God's purposes. For an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God, the hell that real Dante writes works in counter to that in every possible way. It's a place of pure spite. Still, this concept is nothing new. The so-called problem of hell is one of the oldest questions in theology. The further fictional Dante goes, the less he complains. Fictional Dante will occasionally ask how he can better help the damned souls. He will make comments about how miserable they look. but by and large we don't really see him make judgments on whether or not he believes people deserve to be here, unless it's his old mate Filippo Argenti, who he absolutely hates. The further fictional Dante goes, the less he complains and the more he begins to kind of just accept that the tormented souls deserve to be in eternal punishment. Game Dante is kept at a certain separation that allows players to judge hell through him, and those judgments will never be favourable. Although he is an active participant in the sense that he runs riot in hell, farting on their pillows and eating the leftover pizza Lucifer had his eye on, and although he is forced to face his own morality one miserable step at a time, he is morally passive when it comes to the judgment of others. He makes little comment, allowing the player to form their own judgments. The player is consistently brought to respect, appreciate, and challenge Inferno all at once. So where do we begin? Well, separately, depending on the Dante we're interested in. Fictional Dante begins his journey in a dark forest. This is not the case for game Dante, although the dark forest is purchasable as DLC that may or may not still be available. I honestly don't remember, so we'll cover that at the end. We won't, sorry, I'm lying here. Game Dante begins his journey in Acre, at the time part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The first level is based on the massacre at Acre, as part of the Third Crusade, which took place in 1119 and was led by King Richard. The bulk of the adaptation was kept largely consistent with the original poem, but Dante's origin story is super different. Three major facets of Game Dante's life are rewritten. Firstly, we are actually given a background for Game Dante. We learn about his family, specifically an evil, abusive father and a sad, frail mother who died when he was young. Second, he is married to Beatrice, a character that serves as a spiritual guide for fictional Dante in Inferno. As with a lot of things about Dante, it's not 100% confirmed who this is based on, if anyone, but it's largely assumed that this Beatrice is based on Beatrice Portinari. He had only met her twice before her death 10 years before this poem was written. There's a lot to say about Beatrice, but I would be taking the flow of this video out back of the shed to die if I wrote it all here, so we'll talk about her later. In the poem, she is basically a beautiful angel who sends people to help fictional Dante on his journey. In the game, she is his wife, and her brother Francesco is Dante's best friend. And 3, Dante is written into history as a bloodthirsty soldier who commits incredible acts of violence under the pretense of religion. King Richard and the Pope alike are portrayed with demonic faces when they give their orders that include the atrocities of the Crusades, but Game Dante is never shown to be a man who defies those orders. In fact, while real-life King Richard killed around 3,000 hostages in Acre when negotiations with Saladin broke down, leading to Saladin murdering all his Christian prisoners in retaliation, the game pins this and many more on Game Dante instead. He was the one who made the order to have all of the hostages massacred and was actually gleeful about it. When King Richard comes along like, who ordered all these hostages to be murdered? I specifically said not to murder the hostages. Francesco takes the fall for Dante and is executed by hanging. Game Dante is demonically cruel. There's no question that we need to treat him with enormous contempt. And wait, there's more. For some bizarre reason, Beatrice makes a deal with the devil for Dante's safe return. She basically wagers, he will never cheat on me, and Lucifer is like, okay, bet. How about this? I promise I will return Dante to you without a scratch on him, but if he cheats on you, your soul is mine. Beatrice is like, that sounds totally reasonable, and Dante cheats on her, and her soul is Satan's. Unfortunately, Dante cheated on her with a hostage who offered sex in exchange for the safety of her brother and her, only he wasn't her brother, he was her husband. So when Dante agrees and sets them both free, the husband stabs Dante in the back and then goes to Florence to murder Dante's father and Beatrice. Dante shows up too late.
I gave my word.
Yeah, Dante's a massive dick in this. I know this is apples and oranges considering one's a 700-year-old daddy issue incarnate and one's a Kratos derivative, but I much prefer Game Dante to fictional Dante. Real Dante lacked the self-awareness to understand just how proud his writing was, and that making fictional Dante bow before his written universe's rules was nothing short of eye-rolling irony. Game Dante is truly irredeemable, and yet his journey through literal hell is so soul-shaking that he comes out the other side as a different person, broken and remade by hardship no human can begin to comprehend. Since he's also a player's stand-in, you have some, albeit limited, autonomy in this world. You are able to find some damned souls on your travels, people like the aforementioned Francesca da Polenta and Paolo Malatesta, and either damn them to eternal suffering or absolve them, sending them to heaven. I found these choices were enough to cultivate feelings of emotional investment that it helped me begin to weigh the consequences of my in-game actions, regardless of how fictional and inconsequential they were. I genuinely began to sit there and think, does this person deserve millions, nay billions of years of unimaginable torture in exchange for eating too much? In exchange for killing your father in revenge for him killing your mother? For having sex in the bum? Not really. Even the nastier damned souls got a pass from me. I never met a single damned soul I could justify eternal damnation for. In fact, I played this game when I was about 17 years old, and I am almost ashamed to admit that this game had such a profound impact on me in my teens that it left me a militant, bitter atheist for a long time. What little faith I had after 11 years of Roman Catholic schooling and Church of England schooling was obliterated by the depiction of morality in this game. I lean more agnostic these days, but for a while I was repulsed by the concept of an afterlife as presented to me like this. You can say someone deserves to be in hell 1,000 times over and it's just words, but even a simulated version of this theology proved to be more than enough for me, and if that's not piqued your interest in this game, I don't know what will. If you weren't aware, I love Inferno, and my love for Inferno began with this game. Over the years I've collected a few different adaptations of the story and had the pleasure of trawling through them all to make this video. I'll link them all in the description if you want to pick some up for yourself. First up, we'll be using the 1814 translation by the Reverend Henry Cary. This isn't even considered the best translation, but it's the one I have and I find it pretty serviceable. If I quote from the poem, I'll be quoting from this book specifically, so feel free to grab a copy if you want to read it for yourself. Secondly, we have the Divine Comedy simplified and modernized. This is what I use when I read verses I just don't understand. This was written specifically to be accessible to a modern audience with an emphasis on catering to neurodivergent people or people with dyslexia. I don't always agree with the interpretation this book takes of some scenes, but I figure it's better to have half an idea than no idea. Next, we have Inferno, Divina Commedia by Acre Games. This is a translation produced by an Italian company as a companion piece to their 5e adaptation of Dante's Inferno, specifically for tabletop nerds to make their own campaigns with. The interpretations don't largely differ from anyone else's I've seen, but great effort has been made to keep this to 3-line stanzas, and it's full of incredible art. I was looking for pictures of Cerberus one day, found an awesomely grisly one, followed links through to the artist's art station, then found this book and bought it the moment I managed to find a supplier that would deliver to the UK. This is more spectacle than anything, but I love it. And finally, the crown jewel of my collection, Dante's Inferno for kids and curious parents. This is one of the best handcrafted pieces of art I've ever had the pleasure of owning. Dante's Inferno for kids and curious parents is a fully illustrated book full of facts and interpretations I found nowhere else. It's not heavy on detail, but the details it provides are always unique. I always find something new in this book. You can tell I treat this thing with reverence. There's not a single scribble on the pages of this book. Only post-its for true art. They made Purgatorio and Paradiso books too, but only in Italian. I don't think there's any plans to change that anytime soon, which is devastating. I won't share much of it because I don't want to basically give away these authors' hard work, but I will show you one thing. The most important page of this book is actually the first page, the map of hell. The Inferno of Inferno has been depicted 1,000,000 times over by 1,000,000 different artists, but the crux of the depiction lies in a few factors that remain consistent regardless of era, art style, and artist. Hell is an inverted cone, wider at the top near the surface of the earth and thinner at the bottom. The cone is split into segments, 9 circles, each composed of entirely different biomes. Everything from the ground underfoot to the sky above, if there even is one, varies, like levels in a video game. Hey, they should make one of those. Although most drawings featuring Dante himself often feel lonely, just him standing in darkness, occasionally with Virgil, quietly pondering the plight of a lone miserable soul before him, maps of hell tend to evoke pure chaos. Not only do these maps often come brimming with figures of the tortured damned like ants on a Diet Coke spill, but the mere architecture of the place is messy, lopsided, clustered, and unusually claustrophobic. It feels a place packed to the brim, like no more souls could ever possibly fit in amongst the hordes, yet simultaneously there's always room for more. Its divine origins make it eternal, but hell is a place on Earth in Inferno, and its physical constraints feel woefully mortal. As you can see, there's a lot more to this than 9 mere circles. Our main circles of hell are Limbo, Lust, Gluttony, Greed, Wrath, Heresy, Violence, Fraud, and Treachery, split into 3 regions, upper, middle, and lower, as we'll call them. They're festooned with all sorts of extra moments for Dante, landmarks, places he visits, and big-name historical figures he meets. The door to hell and the river Acheron, Minos, Medusa, the river Styx, the Phlegethon, and who can forget Lucifer himself squatting at the bottom, not to mention the many sub-levels occupying most circles of hell, each equating to a different type or severity of sin. For example, how Wrath is split into sub-levels reserved for those who commit violence against others, violence against the self, and violence against God, or the 10 Malabulges of fraud. Dante's interpretation of hell wasn't new or unique, but it was sick and extremely adaptable into games and D&D campaigns alike, so it became the most infamous. The concept of hell isn't even really described in the Bible, although there are various references to fire in the afterlife. Contrapasso, souls in hell, punished with torments befitting the sin, is post-biblical. I've seen arguments that passages like Luke 10, where Jesus seems to be referencing comparative punishments, are potentially passages where Dante got his ideas, but I've looked at them and they're too vague. Maybe, maybe not, but there's not really a way to know. A far more likely theory is that Dante got his ideas for the topography of hell by taking ideas present in Greek mythology and adapting them to Christianity. Dante loved ancient Greece. His world is full of ancient Greece, figures both real and mythological, and his hell follows a similar structure. Ancient Greek mythology believed in a segmented underworld containing 4 main regions: Tartarus, Asphodel Fields, Elysium, and the Stygian Marsh. Unlike Christian hell, which is for all of the nasties, the Greek underworld held everyone. Tartarus was hell as we would understand it, Asphodel was for the normies, Elysium was for the legends. Sometimes Greek hell is depicted as a big flat set of islands, or one big continent separated by the rivers Styx, Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon, and Lethe, similar to the hell in the Divine Comedy. Sometimes, although less often, it is depicted as a series of 4 levels with Tartarus at the bottom. If you've played Hades, you'll be familiar with that layout. The 3-headed dog Cerberus guards the underworld and decides which of the 3 places you'll be assigned to. There's a lot of 3s in mythology. Dante's guide Virgil also wrote a ton about Greek mythology, especially the Greek underworld. He was Dante's idol, rendering this another contributing factor. In fact, scrap the Bible stuff. In my opinion, Dante ripped like 90% of his inspo from the ancient Greek afterlife Pinterest board, then applied it to his own theology to make something completely new and absolutely unforgettable. Now let's assume that fictional Dante and game Dante both wind up in hell in exactly the same way. They go to Acre, there's a big massacre, lots of flashbacks, big fight at the Citadel, and even before the game starts there's an interesting detail. If we were to hold up 2 shots of Dante fighting the minions of Acre and the minions of hell side by side, we see something really interesting. The models and animations are identical, only reskinned between living and dead. Now there's an obvious reason for this. The team needed to make a prologue with an enemy type you'd never see again, so they reused animations from the basic hell enemies. Practical and simple, makes sense. Yet also, we can use their inhuman mannerisms, their janky staggers across the battlefield, their animalistic fighting tactics, as evidence to suggest that this is how Dante sees them. Dante refers to the people of Acre so many times as demons and heretics. Through his eyes, we, a man responsible for the death of 3,000 hostages, fight the quote-unquote real enemy, the real evil. Dante's attitudes towards the hostages are reminiscent of the attitudes of the Crusades themselves, that the Holy Lands need to be freed from the animal scourge of Saladin's people, and the game's visuals enforce that. Even if unintentional, it added so much to Dante's characterization in the prologue as he mows them down without mercy, without even breaking a sweat. Anyway, Dante gets stabbed in the back by the husband of the woman who offered him comfort. The Grim Reaper shows up, and he's got some nasty news for Dante. Everlasting damnation for your sins. Dante's like, what? The bishop assured us we'd be absolved of all our sins. Grimm's like, yeah, I get that a lot, sorry to break it to you, and engages Dante in one massive mortal showdown, his soul hanging in the balance. Dante bests him easily, and the Reaper begs for his life.
No, please don't.
Or, if you're my brother, the Grim Reaper open palm slaps you across the chops so hard that you fall out of the map. Shaking it off like a stiff Pilates session, Dante just hops on his horse and cashes in the rest of his annual leave for an early trip home to surprise the wife. On the way, he takes a tapestry and sews it onto his skin. I'd say by miracle it doesn't get infected, but spoilers, our man's fatal stabbing doesn't get undone just because you take the Grim Reaper round back of the chippy and uppercut him so hard his head twists the other way, like a Tom and Jerry sketch. Only there's a small complication. Dante's father is dead, stabbed through the eye with his own crucifix, and Beatrice is dead. And topless, because the writers felt it absolutely crucial that she always be topless in every scene she's in, even when her gently cooling corpse is draped across the petunias Mr. Inferno spent so long nurturing into life. She has a sword sticking out of her chest. When Dante touches her, her spirit comes out to say hello and let him know she made a deal with him, a foggy man that leers at Dante from beside her and is whisked away without a word, up to the church. This prologue is peppered with flashback sequences, but the most important one is the one that occurs when Dante arrives at the church. We see a bishop, and are never given his name, assure a crowd of crusaders, including Dante, that in payment for taking the cross to reclaim the Holy Land, your Immaculate Father hereby absolves you of all of your sins. And this scene is so interesting. Firstly, we see the flimsy reassurance that Dante takes to mean that he can basically treat this like a lad's holiday, cheat on the missus, kill whoever he wants, do whatever he wants, and God will look the other way because he is righteous. Secondly, and the one I get most hyped about, because the demonic visage of this pope seems to be designed in reference to a much later part of Inferno. Dante learns across his travels that should you commit a sin of treachery so evil that it literally cannot be absolved by any means whatsoever, it is simply so evil that God won't even look at you again, your soul goes straight to the 9th circle of hell and is replaced by a demon that occupies your living body. I feel like this bishop's design is intended to imply that such a thing has happened. He looks demonic and bestial. He leads the crusaders astray with false promises. He causes thousands of men to sin in abundance, committing the worst crimes imaginable because he makes a lot of lofty promises. I feel as though the bishop of Dante's story behaves as he does because he was possessed by a demon long ago, and now merely works as an agent of chaos to ensure the crusaders get funneled down to hell. In fact, this is where we will find many of Dante's crusader cohorts when we get to the lower levels. Even though they were tricked by this so-called bishop, they're still ultimately responsible for the state of their souls when they die, so they all end up going to hell. We see Francesco here looking wide-eyed, human and trusting. Dante, however, is beginning to look almost as demonic as the bishop himself, implying that he too is capable of sins so extreme that he is on a fast track to the 9th circle and may be claimed by the legions of hell long before his earthly body dies. With that flashback concluded, so begins one of the most impactful gaming transitions of all time. I was lucky enough to play this without knowing that was going to happen, and I sat there in awe. The physical allegory of the crucifix collapsing into the depths, Dante's descent into hell, the fire and brimstone that bubbles up against the cool earthly grey of the church, magnificent. Each section of hell, as described in Inferno, is adapted for this game. Some parts are played by the book, so to speak, but they take great liberties with other parts of the book that are occasionally genius, occasionally controversial, but always interesting. You'll always see how they got there, at least. One of my favourite aspects of this game can be found right at the beginning. Dead souls arrive at the gates of hell, upon which are written that infamous warning, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." This is the quintessential vision of hell. Fire, brimstone, sulphur, darkness, infinite screaming. Dante enters this place after a short skirmish with something called an Asterian beast, a creature not in the original poem. While yes, it sounds very similar to that devilish man from Baldur's Gate, the Asterian beast could be referenced to any number of things. Most likely, the Minotaur, to which the Asterian beast bears a resemblance, was one of two ancient mythological figures called the Asteri. Asterion was also the name of King Minos's father. King Minos kept the Minotaur in his labyrinth, and can also be found down here in hell as a prominent figure. A third, less likely similarity is Astaroth, a Duke of Hell you can go and read about if you like, but I won't be covering here today since the only link is the name and it's tenuous at that. Rending open the black doors of hell, Dante finds only an abyss. Other damned souls scream as they plummet endlessly into this space, the shores of the Acheron River, swallowed by the smoke of the eternal fires, drowned by a hellish colour palette of red and black and brown and grey. This area is an area of volume, and rightly so. This is where every damned soul arrives. Although they will be sorted across the many levels and sub-levels of hell, this is the river every damned soul must cross. Dante's Inferno makes an enormous effort to communicate the sheer size of a place like that. We see holes in the brittle grey wall churning souls out like waterfalls of the dead, drowning in their own screams. We see structures of rock carrying queues of crowds of the damned below to where they will be sorted. Even Charon, depicted always as an old man with eyes of fire, the ferryman of the dead, has fused with his boat. No longer does he have a little little rowboat carrying like 10 people across at once. He is the boat, and he's the size of a cruise ship, and even then it's not enough to handle the sheer volume of souls that fall upon this place. The sense of scale here is depressing. The imagery here is Holocaust adjacent. Not only is this a miserable place, but it is imposingly miserable, enormous, cavernous misery. Charon's size isn't the only difference between game and poem. There's a certain kind of sinner mentioned in the poem as being here, but isn't, to my knowledge, included. See, Virgil meets you here. His design is really cool, and although he never actually moves, he will stand at certain checkpoints in game to speak to you and deliver exposition. Sometimes he quotes lines from Inferno directly, but often it's paraphrased to A, make it feel more like a conversation, and B, to accommodate for a modern audience who didn't sign up to decipher Middle English translations of Old Italian as the screams of millions ring in their ears. And Virgil recounts a special type of sinner, one wanted by neither heaven or hell. In the poem he describes, "Suffer the wretched souls who lived without praise or blame, not yet true to God, but for themselves were only. From his bounds heaven drove them forth, not to impair his lustre, nor the depth of hell receives them." Essentially, if you thought there might be a loophole in the heaven-hell system whereby you could bypass hell and go straight to heaven by simply doing nothing that could be considered good or evil, you're out of luck. These people are found here at the gates. Rejected by heaven because their neutrality would impair God's lustre, these souls are also refused entry to hell. In the poem, they are punished miserably. Dante sees a huge crowd of them running under a banner, swarmed by bugs that sting them so much that they're covered in blood, forcing them to keep running forever without any rest. The insect stings represent reminders to act. They didn't do that in life, so they are forced to do that in death on the shores of the Acre for eternity. Although Virgil references this group specifically in some of his dialogue here, I personally couldn't see them. Like, I literally couldn't see them. There doesn't appear to be any flag-bearing crowds getting stung by bees in this game. Virgil is, however, standing in front of a huge panorama in which we see flaming souls falling and screaming. Maybe this adaptation features this punishment instead. These souls can't do anything but fall, representing the way they fell through life, only now they're always on fire. If intentional, this is one of the really interesting ways this adaptation rethinks some of the punishments in hell in ways that align better with the medium of gameplay and software. Having crowds running with banners might be hard to accommodate into level design. It might be difficult for a PS3 to run at any competent kind of fidelity. So instead of removing them entirely or half-arsing something that might come out looking really bad or running really slow, they rethought an entire subsection of hell itself in ways that still communicated eternal torture. If it's not intentional, then fuck me, I guess. In fact, this gaming adaptation of Inferno opens so many doors into how they might apply aspects of history, mythology, and religion to the story of Dante. Poems don't typically have collectibles, but games do, and Dante's Inferno has quite a few different types of collectibles. Damned souls, relics, pieces of silver. Yes, as though Judas Iscariot had a hole in his pocket as he was, spoilers, dragged down to the bottom layer. 30 pieces of silver can be found littered through this hellscape. Picking these coins up grants a boatload of souls, the game's currency, which can be used to purchase abilities, and 3 achievements titled Footsteps of a Traitor, Betrayed with a Kiss, and Well Done, Judas. I don't have much to say about these beyond how much I love the creativity involved in adapting this story for modern audiences and video games. There was no intention to deliver this poem straight. It was adapted with a flourish I have never seen replicated in any other historical game I've played. My favourite collectible type are the Damned Souls, which build off the back of the Absolve Punish mechanic we're introduced to the moment we learn we can land finishes on enemies. Absolve and Punish are fantastic implementations of a moral choice system because they represent exactly the concepts behind making difficult choices on a small scale. Let's say you find a wallet on the ground. The owner's ID is in there. There's also 300 quid tucked inside. If you wanted to be a good person, you could take the wallet and mail it to the owner. You could hand it in to a local establishment in case the owner comes by looking for it. You could search around for the owner. All of these options take time. All of these options are boring, and you're neither promised nor owed a reward or even a thank you if the wallet owner is that rude. Being a good person is something that requires time and effort with no expectation of reward. On the other hand, you could take the wallet, or you could take the money and toss the wallet, or you could just leave the wallet on the ground knowing that someone else might steal it, or you could steal the money and just hand the wallet in. Being a bad person is easy, low effort, and often higher reward. People don't fall to evil because it's hard, they fall to evil because it's easy. The same can be said for Dante's moral choice system. Absolving damned souls requires you to go through a 30-second pointless minigame that requires minimal skill and is honestly not all that fun. Absolving demons and minor enemies asks that you button mash, and if you're in a huge group of them, means you have a lot of button mashing to do. On the flip side, punishing enemies takes only a second and looks awesome. It's an easier rhythm to get into if you're excited to see the rest of the game. Although these choices feel arbitrary, I found them the perfect representation of making moral choices. To add flavour to these moments, damned souls, as in the Absolve Punish collectible, will be named individuals from history or mythology. They're scattered across hell. The first one we meet is Pontius Pilate, the man who had Jesus crucified, and he is very sorry. If he is mentioned in Inferno, it's on the shores of Acre, and it is kept intentionally ambiguous. So it's up to you on whether real poet Dante thought it prudent to include him. Although you might need to engage in tricky traversal to meet these souls, you'll hear them from far away. Each damned soul has a selection of quotes they'll utter into the uncaring void that gives you a tickle of context as to their situation, why they did what they did, and how they felt. Pontius will shout things like, "What shall I do with this false messiah? I find no fault with this man. You say he has declared himself king? You have handed him over only out of envy. This man and his rabble stormed the temple." When you meet them, when Dante grasps them and prepares himself to make his absolve punish decision, we see a short description on why exactly they are in hell. This game makes a lot of effort to plainly state the source of the sin just as much as it aims to explain the sin itself, and then give the damned soul spoken lines that create an impression of their character. They don't always nail this. Thais the Harlot lies in a later layer of hell, and her description is just as damning as her description in Inferno. She stands out against the other damned souls in the game, but on the whole is pretty good at providing a description of the sinner that feels impartial. Pontius Pilate is one such soul who sees a very sympathetic view with context that an average player might not know. I learned about Pontius at my Catholic primary school, and assumed he was basically the devil for a long time. I suppose my headmaster didn't have the time to teach us the intricacies of local politics. Basically, tensions were high in Jerusalem when Jesus and his followers entered the temple and began toppling tables over. It's valid to assume that Pontius and the Pharisees assumed he was a rebel leader who, to their knowledge, had declared himself king. Pontius's hands were tied, and quite frankly, I wouldn't have known if it wasn't for this game. When I heard him announce things like, "You say he declared himself king," referencing the moment he asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" in John, and declares, "This man and his rabble stormed the temple," I did some reading and understood more of the context of Jesus' crucifixion. As always, the issue with 2,000-year-old history is that we simply don't have the answers. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying the issue here, but this video would be 10 times as long if we did a full historical deep dive on the context of every damned soul Dante encounters in hell. For the sake of time and efficiency, some records paint Pontius as a maniacal villain. Some stories depict him as a remorseful accomplice. Everyone writing those records had their own reasons for having those opinions, which we will never be truly privy to. History is not black and white, and studies of history are hindered particularly by the mere fact that we have so few lenses remaining to view them through. With that gap in knowledge, Dante's Inferno takes a far more sympathetic view. I appreciate that his representation in Dante's Inferno is balanced to accommodate wider historical context, whilst also standing back and allowing players to literally make their own choices on the basis of the game's limited representation. Like, it still sucks about the Cruce, obviously, sorry Big J, but I felt far more sympathetic towards Pontius after playing this game than I ever had before. The moral choice system in this game isn't just good choice, bad choice, but challenges the player to look at a face value sin and make some difficult decisions. It serves fantastically at presenting us not with the crime, but with the soul who committed it. To add flavour to each level of hell, the many souls surrounding Dante will scream different things depending on your location. Hell is so full that souls are crammed into the very walls that you climb on, and it's during these climbing segments that you can hear their laments most clearly. The souls at the gates of hell scream things like, "I can't move," and "Where are we going?" adding a piteous tone to your traversal, like you are surrounded by people who are lost and confused, and wondering why death didn't bring them the rest they clearly hoped they'd receive. Anyway, Dante finds a way to swing over to Karen's big wooden face.
You there, stand aside from those that are dead. Where is Beatrice? She made a very foolish wager. Take me to her! My life, my soul for her return! You fool, those belong to us already.
Whoops, guess we're going to hell now. With the boat now full and Karen fueled up on a horrifying cocktail of pre-workout and carb-heavy hell spaghetti, he's ready to set sail. Dante begins down in the vessel, where he meets Orpheus, poor Orpheus, and he's able to sit and reflect on what brought him here. We see a bitter flashback to the moment he promised Beatrice that he would keep Francesco, her brother, safe. A flashback that ends with a shot of Dante stabbing a puddle with Francesco's face on it, so it probably all went great, no problems, and we're free to wreak havoc on the boat. This section of the game is truly excellent. This goes on for a while, literally exactly as long as it takes you to complete the combat segment on Karen's big hairy back. Ew, but that can take maybe 10 minutes. With the expanse of the Acre reeling out in every direction under a screaming, thunderous, stormy sky, gameplay and world building again operate hand in hand. The scale of this place feels infinite, adding to the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Feeling that similar panic, Dante rips Karen's head off and flings it as far as he can. Give it some fucking welly, Dante. The Gates of Hell are an impressive introduction to a game that will consistently continue to meet that bar, no exceptions, for the rest of its runtime. This Dante is no fainter. He lands on his feet in Limbo, home of my favourite boss in the entire game. One of the reasons he's my favourite boss is the dread of his approach. King Minos waits for you at the edge of Limbo, where he judges damned souls, and you can see him in the distance, basically from the moment you arrive. He looks terrifying. His voice booms and echoes across the thunderous expanse of Limbo. His mannerisms are utterly inhuman. He sniffs the air and lurches around like a caged animal, twisting and writhing. He's monstrously huge. Even from this distance, it's evident. And you look at all the detail poured into him and his animations, his position on the map, his obvious role as destination, and you wilt as you realise, yep, I'm gonna have to fight this thing. Virgil meets Dante again here. He never needs to say anything off script strictly. He's not sitting there like Hunter on Spyro, telling you to press X once to jump and twice to glide. Virgil's dialogue is on theme, concise and descriptive. He's here in Limbo to tell us that Limbo is for mortals who did not sin, but lacked a portal to faith. Their punishment is denial of paradise. And yes, before you ask, that does include babies. Game Limbo is one of the furthest in tone from the original poem because it would probably be quite boring to play the one from the original Inferno. It contains the castle mentioned in the poem, you climb through it to reach Minos, but similarities largely stop there. In Inferno, fictional Dante encounters everyone that died before they were able to learn about Christ. I love Limbo in the Divine Comedy. Virgil tells this tale of souls for whom the torture isn't of pain but of grief. They live in abject misery, only so far afflicted that we live desiring without hope. Their torture being that they live outside of God's grace forever. They live without hope, but suffer from desire. I have to say, if I had to choose a circle to live in, I would prefer this to the burning coffins or the rivers of human poopy. Dante says he hears the sounds of grief from every corner of this layer of hell. Quite frankly, I would be partying day and night if I rested with the relief that I wasn't being torn to shreds by demons 24/7, surrounded by famous poets and historical figures alike. But I suppose the grass is always greener. This section of the original poem bears many of real Dante's biases. Biases he doesn't seem to be entirely aware of himself. Real Dante was obsessed with the idea of legacy. Being known by the living after you die. It wouldn't be a leap to know that he was terrified of being forgotten, which is lucky for him because he wrote one of the most famous stories of all time, After Watchmen. Fictional Dante especially grieves the fact that, for well I knew suspended in limbo many a soul of mighty worth. He grieves worth. He's sad that people of value are in hell. He's so torn up about this that he includes a section of Limbo specifically for the really famous dead people. Some clearing in the woods of Limbo where all the super famous historical figures hang out. There's Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, Electra, Caesar, and so many more. At least 30 people are named across the course of just a few verses of this poem. Real Dante takes great pains to include all of his personal idols of history. Obviously then, he writes, they turned to me with salutation kind, they made me of their tribe. There's a lot of debate as to whether the Divine Comedy is self-insert theology fanfiction. A lot. I'm pretty torn on it personally, like, if I draw a leprechaun, am I drawing mythological fan art, or am I drawing an original picture? On the other hand, is the denial of fanfiction a knee-jerk rejection of the concept on the basis that fanfiction as a genre is, as of now, nowhere near the level of respect as an epic poem? Personally, and I'll return to this debate later, I think the Divine Comedy is fanfiction, and moments like these are why. Not just in the instance of Dante meeting his favourite historical figures, but also in their placement in Limbo, a relatively Earth-like area with beautiful castles and special clubhouses for the special poets. A hierarchy based on legacy in so coincidental a way as to stroke Dante's ego when they welcome him in. He can't bear to have his idol Virgil actually suffering in hell, so he places him on the border. That's a conscious choice, to make a little net to catch most of the people he loves and keep them safe. More broadly, Dante loved Greek mythology so much that he took its concepts and wrote a poem where he superimposed Christian theology on top of its template, filled it with figures of both, and got to explore how it would feel to meet and speak to them. He decided its rules, topography, and social climate. Like, this isn't a holy text. This is a man who took concepts he was a fan of and explored them through the medium of fiction. He might have believed them real, but his story was fiction. Either way, yes, Limbo of the Inferno poem is basically a rest stop before the misery begins, a quick meet and greet of the historical figures he couldn't bear to leave out, and a slow introduction to his guide Virgil. That wouldn't have worked all that well in gameplay format, so Limbo of Dante's Inferno is a miserable, cold, grey place, lit only by the occasional disparate fires. Charon is here from where Dante slung him, warning you, eternal, I endure. He says that in the poem, actually. It's pretty sick. And you can get a trophy for rolling him back into the abyss. Limbo's traversal concludes with an all-out epic boss fight against King Minos, yes, the Minotaur guy. Not to be confused with King Midas. I've seen Minos portrayed in a few different ways across the years in the adaptations, but this portrayal is easily my favourite. In the poem, Minos is the judge of the damned. They go up to him and confess their sins, at which point he wraps them in his tail. The number of times he wraps them in his tail corresponds to the layer of hell they'll be sent to. And that's really it, as far as Inferno goes. In my translation, which may not correlate one-to-one with the original, he gets about 3 verses dedicated to him. They're descriptive, but leave a lot to the imagination. Minos stands grinning with ghastly feature, gives sentence and dismisses them beneath according to he foldeth him around. Definitely gives the impression of a man who relishes his newfound career. I certainly don't get the impression that he suffers in hell, but that's about it. Dante's Inferno takes this and runs a marathon with it. In the game, King Minos is a monstrous creature. He's enormous, scaled like a snake with a soft weak spot, his underbelly. His crown is formed from the bones of his own skull, the size of a school bus. Most notably, he is blind. This is clearly a reference to Lady Justice, a personification of morality systems in justice. You might see statues of her outside courtrooms and such. If you've ever seen scales used as iconography relating to justice systems, that also relates to her, as she is often depicted with them. Lady Justice is our modern day depiction, or equivalent, of the Greek goddess Themis, the second wife of Zeus and goddess of law and justice. Combine King Minos' blindness with the sheer volume of sinners raining down on hell at any one time, and you get a man who does not bother to hear them out. This King Minos is able to pick up a sinner, sniff them, and know their greatest sin, for which he bans them to hell. Say what you want, but that's a man who loves his job. His time with Dante is short but memorable.
Sniff again!
In the spirit of fantastic death scenes, Dante kills this king by impaling his tongue on the very spiked wheel Minos used to fling sinners down to the layers of hell below. Have a day off, Minos. Never thought I'd be 25 pages into a script before I even touched on a single proper sin-themed layer of hell. My bad. I love this game, I love this poem, I love its adaptations. I will not apologise for that. Although maybe I shouldn't love it too much, because we're about to arrive in the lust circle of hell. The moment you leave Limbo, you realise you are in over your head with Dante's Inferno. This isn't some series of interconnected corridors and rooms with different coloured wallpaper and a differently phrased welcome mat. Each time you enter a new layer, you may as well be walking on the surface of a new planet. The game hides its loading screens as well as it can for a PS3 game in 2010. Rather than fainting in one layer and waking up in another, Dante scales the walls of each layer himself, using his multi-purpose scythe as a weapon and grappling tool alike. It's in these segments that we are introduced to the Chains of Hell, enormous obstacles that Dante must destroy to pass. Every time he does, we hear distant laughter. I'm sure that's totally fine. Lust is where these 2010 level designers really got to shine. Never before has anyone had such a firm justification to fill a gaming level with tits ass, and thinly veiled penis references. The moment you land on solid ground, a distant tower bursts out of the fog. It's huge, veiny, straight as an arrow, and even has a tip with a little hole in it. The walls of the tower are lined with rock that looks like skin, like you're inside a huge coochie. There are even coochie portals in the walls that enemies spawn from. Damned souls in the walls will scream things like, "Rest your body close to mine." There are snake statues abound. The elevator in the center of the tower reminds me a bit of a sphincter. Welcome to Coochie Town. The Lust Tower will introduce you to a new enemy type, temptresses, embodiments of sin. Naturally, they are nude women and they moan and gyrate across the field, only their vagina is like a zip all the way up the front of their body that opens to reveal an enormous scorpion tail. There were some brilliant designs for these enemies that I wish they'd gone with instead, but I understand that these bizarre Georgia O'Keeffe inspired body unfolding concepts would probably have been really difficult to make, and also lend themselves poorly towards attack animations. Like, what that flower do? It was probably easier to just go with the scorpion tail, and significantly more ESRB rating friendly. And the crown jewel, the level's boss, Queen Cleopatra herself. I didn't love Cleo's design here because I think it's pretty unimaginative compared to the rest of the game. Yeah, I suppose she represents lust. Yeah, I guess that means she's gotta have her titties out and do sexy moaning and keep her mini-boss in her throat, but there was a banger design I saw tucked away in some concept sketches that I really wish they'd run with instead. Like, yeah, I understand why they weren't allowed to go with this. It would never have made it past ratings unless it was so heavily muddied that it amounted to the visual detail of an OG Silent Hill creature, but I mean, how unique, how grim, how horrific. How difficult do you think that thing would be to keep clean? She looks so miserable. I think I would be that miserable if I was tripping over that all day. Anyone else suddenly really fancy a ham sandwich? But yeah, they went with giant sex woman. At least the macrophilia crowd had some extra material. I'm sure they could do with a win. Giant sex Cleopatra spends the entire time climbing this tower, which seems impossibly tall. All the while she announces things like, "I ruled an empire better than any man," and spits the babies from Limbo out of the mouth she has on her breasts instead of nipples. She acknowledges Dante.
Looking for someone?
Well, that's as good a lead as any. Dante's goal is to climb to the top. The tower is enveloped in a screaming hurricane of damned lustful souls, depicted faithfully to the original poem, which describes, bellowing there groaned a noise of a sea in tempest torn by warring winds. The stormy blast of hell with restless fury drives the spirits on, whirled round and dashed amain with sore annoy. Virgil is here to pile on too, adding, desire conquered reason, carnal damned. By the thousands as love parted shades from the world above, citing Helen of Troy and Achilles as one of the many. Essentially, the souls of the damned in hell are buffeted and blown, literally and metaphorically, by their whims in life, descending into lust at every opportunity. This boundary whereby love and sex are all well and good until they get in the way of more important things. In hell, their contrapasso is to be blown around, literally, by an undying hurricane. This hurricane is largely environmental for Dante, although, what do you expect? A Spyro flight level? It's present in the form of a barrier you need to pass with the early lightning puzzle, and in the wind tunnel, it's the wind that pushes the platform up through the tower. During Dante's time in Lust, he is presented with the realities of his own sinful lust in a flashback that shows him willingly sleeping with a female prisoner so that her and her alleged brother, actually husband, could be set free. This is an aspect of the story that really adds to Dante's character. This boy has sinned so much that he has a valid reason to be in each and every layer of hell. Every time he reaches a new layer, he is faced with his sins, forced to reckon with them. Whilst fictional Dante's only defining sin is pride, and even that feels kind of a stretch, game Dante is imbued with so many flaws that it renders his trip through hell a deeply personal and defining experience. Fictional poem Dante and game Dante may leave hell changed, but only game Dante leaves hell absolved. I like Dante's growth because he comes to understand that his actions have consequences that affect more than just himself. Yeah, I know that's a pretty basic lesson, but he's the Middle Ages Western equivalent of a frat boy, and I wouldn't even be confident betting on his ability to wipe his bottom properly, so we'll take the small wins. Dante learns the reality of his cause and effect by seeing the effects his cause has on Beatrice. He loves Beatrice, but he is short-sighted, selfish, and lacks basic empathy. Dante's love for Beatrice eventually overpowers his negative traits, allowing him to cast them aside and focus on learning to better himself through the lessons she teaches him.
I would never do anything to cause this. You don't know what it was like.
But she does know what it was like. I showed her.
Besides Francesca da Polenta and Paolo Malatesta, who we've discussed at length already, Dante meets a character here named Semiramis. I'm so intrigued by this, since she's present in the Divine Comedy too, as one of the Shades' fictional poet Dante meets down here in the second circle of hell. I'm intrigued by her inclusion in particular because Semiramis is a legendary queen based on an ancient historical figure named Semiramat, who absolutely existed. Now, as with all 3,000-year-old history, there are immense gaps. I don't want to oversimplify her story, but I also need to be efficient for the sake of this video. Take my descriptions as a jumping off point rather than gospel truth. If you're interested in learning more about Semiramat, definitely go and do some reading on her. There are so many interpretations on who exactly she was and what exactly she did, and I can't honour them all here. So no one is certain on the specifics of Semiramat's reign as queen, but she did reign, and that's the intriguing part. Female rulers were not typically tolerated in her time, but Semiramat remained queen after the death of her husband. It's believed that she ruled Neo-Assyria on behalf of her son until he came of age, so she was tolerated as an exceptional case. She was one of the most renowned figures of her time. Curiously, Semiramis was the legend created based upon her, with likely a few influences from here and there, and Semiramis the legend was the character inserted into the Divine Comedy by real poet Dante Alighieri, and consequently made it into Dante's Inferno. It's not uncommon for characters of fiction like Robin Hood and Sherlock Holmes to see multiple iterations and additions to their canon by multiple authors as stories and adaptations are added and woven into their existing tapestry. Some are fanon, but some details become canon over the years. The same can be said for Semiramis, who eventually ended up on the receiving end of tales told that painted her as a debauched horror, a woman who made incest legal just so she could fornicate with her own son, a woman who shagged horses, a woman who murdered her lovers when they amassed too much power. It's for this reason that Semiramis was placed into the circle of lust in the Divine Comedy, and later the Dante's Inferno game adaptation. Including Semiramis over Semiramat was emblematic of real poet Dante's wish to tackle characters of his choosing, fictional or otherwise, rather than focusing on accuracy. The chances he made on who to include and in what form are really telling, and this detail is fairly neglected in the game's adaptation, where Semiramis is nothing but a collectible. It would have been great to understand more in the moment. Dante reaches the peak of the Tower of Lust and battles Cleopatra, who keeps her mini-boss Mark Antony in her mouth, occasionally healing him as he fights Dante as her champion. Cleopatra has some lines about the overarching plot, namely, you gave up the keys of the kingdom for the tits of a slave girl, and once Lucifer's path is reopened, her part in this to play will seem so small, but by and large she serves as the fun conclusion to the game's first proper level, and an eye-rolling sex-themed finishing move. Hell yeah, this really was the most 2010 game of all time.
What these shades could not satisfy in life, in death they shall be denied for eternity.
Your arrival in Gluttony is marked by a new kind of wall obstacle. Puffy wall sphincters that belch out huge farts of fire. Even before we get to this layer, we get the sense that this place reeks of stomach acid and the kind of poos you'd be doing after a curry night sesh at the local Wetherspoons. Were the walls of lust to look like the whispery inner folds of a genital's interior, Gluttony's walls are rich red and cakey, like intestinal lining. This place takes the bowels of the earth at face value. You'll notice very early into this level that Gluttony features a hell reinterpretation that borders on heresy. Cerberus is a famous character depicted across everything from Hades to the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy to My Little Pony to Harry Potter. The representation is consistent. Big angry dog. Concept artist Wayne Barlow dredged up a design that you might hate for this game's depiction of Cerberus. Rather than running face first into sketching out an angry puppy dog, Wayne thought, what if we took the Great Worm Savage Cerberus line literally? And so this game's depiction of Cerberus was born. The fight is injected into the game awkwardly. We have the Cleopatra boss fight and then a bit of parkour, and then we stumble straight into the waiting arms of everyone's favourite guard dog. As with King Minos, the cool part of this fight is how far away you can see it from. Cerberus looks from afar like some strange flat face in the mud, like if a trapdoor spider had a three-headed worm in it, and its trapdoor was actually a blobfish wearing a shirt with sleeves. I hated this depiction initially, being 17 years old and excited to see a dog. Nowadays, I like it. In the poem, Dante describes Cerberus as a cruel monster, fierce and strange. Through his wide threefold throat barks as a dog, his eyes glare crimson, black his unctuous beard, his belly large, and clawed the hands. I like this description. While it compares Cerberus's bark to a dog, real poet Dante never 100% specified that Cerberus was a dog. Maybe because he assumed we would just see Cerberus as a dog regardless, or maybe because he wanted to emphasize monster over loyal hound. Either way, Barlow took this idea and ran a mile with it in the other direction, staying literal to the original text but building an incredibly cool new boss fight, especially since all of the game's larger bosses are stationary. It might have been too difficult to build a big mobile dog that sprints around the battlefield. A stationary worm that drags itself along with two human arms was likely much easier to build a fun boss fight around without compromising on the monster's size or the game's performance. Cerberus's presence is really the only detail we're privy to regarding Gluttony. It's a huge layer full of shades lying in the mud getting torn to shreds by a big angry dog. Chaco, Dante's friend, can be found here in the original poem and the game. My favourite detail about Chaco can be found in the poem. He talks to Dante for a while, answering questions about hell. Then he says, "No more I tell thee, answer thee no more," and lies back down in the mud. Dante is confused, and Virgil tells him, no more his bed he leaves, ere the last angel trumpet blow. Basically, he's not getting up until the last angel trumpet blows. The implication of Virgil's words are that the shades are in a trance of sorts. Rather than being fully conscious, autonomous people suffering for eternity in hell, he seems dormant. My main question about hell and its contrapassos is, wouldn't you get used to it eventually? Being in hurricanes, being steeped in shit, lying under rain fire, don't you get tired of it? Chaco basically going into rest mode and lying back in the mud felt like it offered an answer to that. Like his wider consciousness shuts down and he's just dazed, in the mud, suffering miserably in the moment, every moment. But that's my interpretation. Speaking of interpretations, Dante's Inferno runs wild with Gluttony. It can't just be a boss fight, that would render a very short layer of hell indeed, so they go the extra mile to create a landscape of pure violent bodily suffering. I could be wrong, it could just be my version of the poem, but I believe the shades are lying in mud in this layer. It's smelly mud, don't get me wrong, but Dante Alighieri was very explicit when stating that people were lying in poo versus lying in mud, and he makes no mention of it here. In Dante's Inferno, the landscape is this wretched swamp of bodily fluids. The sloshing mess that forms the foundation of Gluttony seems to be everything foul. It feels like a cocktail of stomach acid, bile, poo, everything, and the damned souls of Gluttony can be seen screaming and struggling in the mire all the while. This whole area is like one massive intestine. It's full of teeth and jaws and tongues and eyes. You drop down through throats, fight meatworms and flesh monsters, jump through gnashing jaws and over bubbling brooks of shit. Corpses scream, "I cannot control this hunger," as you scale them. It's a super gore nest. This layer feels inspired by the works of artist Hieronymus Bosch from the visual noise alone. Virgil here explains to game Dante the concept of perfect punishment. As it goes in the Divine Comedy, everyone who sins badly goes to hell, everyone who tries hard and repents sins goes to heaven, etc, etc. Purgatory is more a community service of absolution to earn access to heaven. You know the drill. Only their souls go to these places, since their bodies are buried up on the surface or cremated or whatever. The last angel trumpet blow Virgil mentioned while speaking to Chaco is an allusion to the Revelation. Chaco will be in a trance until the Last Judgment. What exactly happens when the last trumpet sounds is a belief that differs between denominations, from annihilationism to Christian universalism. As it happens, real Dante Alighieri was about to introduce an entirely new interpretation. Virgil explains to Dante that, come Judgment Day, everyone who is still down in hell will have their bodies given back to them. Eternal punishment will continue as before, only it will be perfect, as Virgil describes it. Perfect as in perfect pain, perfect suffering, i.e. pain and suffering that are much, much worse, as the human body will feel the pain and not just the soul. I find it so intriguing, this concept that the soul suffering is lesser than the body suffering. I don't know how I'd imagine that hierarchy of pain myself, but I feel as though I would assume the soul would suffer worse than the mere physical body, which feels so vulnerable and fleeting. As you continue to traverse this layer of hell, you'll eventually reach an area starkly different from the rest. It's a small enclosed space full of portals composed of the stones of an old church. Dante encounters several enemies called gluttons here, who are busy devouring damned souls. He also encounters Lucifer, who begins to challenge Dante on how he could possibly think his sins were beyond reproach. Having been obstinate, stubborn, and immature up until this point, Lucifer's questions draw attention to Dante's flaws. Lucifer's questions point at Dante's fragile defenses against judgment, laughing when Dante claims a mere bishop promised him salvation.
I took up the crusade. The bishop assured us that our sins would be absolved.
And you believed him. You actually believed these salesmen of salvation.
Dante is force-fed flashbacks of his own gluttony. We see the way he would indulge in drink and the company of women during the Crusades. Francesco, remember, Beatrice's brother, was forced to watch, sheepishly asking Dante to reconsider his actions. We flash back even further and witness a younger Dante watch and learn from his hedonistic father, overfilling his drink as giggling sirens hang off his arm. He must escape this small area by hopping through portals that warp space around him, representing the way this interaction is causing his perspective to change. All the while, visions of Beatrice float miserably in the space beyond, just out of reach. There's only one issue I have with this part of the game, and it's in the story, or rather, the world building. Dante asks Lucifer where the people of Saladin's kingdom are, the lost souls he killed. Lucifer, smiling, tells him they thought their cause was holy too, but this isn't their hell, it's yours. I get it, like, it adds this extra futility to Dante's quest. Not only did he go to hell for his cause, but so did they. No one won except the bishop, and even then his victory is fleeting and earthly. He'll be right down here too eventually, if he isn't already. It also acknowledges the idea that Christianity isn't the only reality. That said, I feel like this statement shouldn't be here. I'm not religious, so my engagement with this game is purely on the basis of fiction. Even so, I'm not gonna bark if Christianity is the only canon religion of a fictional game based on a poem written hundreds of years ago. I won't sit here and point a finger and be like, this game doesn't respect other religions, since this game is fiction. The poem was fiction. The issue of a statement like this is more in the way it collapses the concept of limbo and the very logic of who goes to hell, heaven, and other. Why are pagans in limbo if they have their own afterlife? Why is Attila the Hun here? Was he Christian? I don't think so. My best case reading of this is to assume Lucifer means they'll be down in the wrath part of hell, the only part of hell they'll ever know, and this gluttony part of hell is not their hell, so to speak. But for me to make that conclusion means I have to personally jump to that conclusion. Upon leaving Gluttony, if you have collected all of the Beatrice Stone collectibles up until this point, you will have all three and you will unlock the auto-absolve ability. As Dante comes to understand what sin really means, and as he begins his journey of repentance towards a woman he never failed to disappoint at every single turn, he unlocks the ability to forgive those around him of their sins a little easier. Greed is next on the roster, and the first thing we encounter here is the Crown of Carthage. Not much to say here beyond my mate loves Carthage, so it always feels like a sweet little shout out just for me when I pop by the Greed souvenir store and see the Crown of Carthage. Greed is a starkly contrasting visual. The walls are coal black, lined with veins of glittering gold. The level opens out onto a huge chamber with a big golden wheel, the Wheel of Fortune, and layers of machinery for smelting and forging. This whole layer reeks of industry. You get the sense that stuff is made here. There's an atmosphere of productivity, but we don't get the sense that anything is produced. What are they making? More precious metal items to line the walls? Weapons? Surely nothing that goes back to the surface. Greed's layer of hell mimics the relentless rat race of growth for growth's sake. Although all layers of hell are full of all kinds of suffering, this is the first layer that really gives a sense of misery. Damned souls are crammed into molten veins of gold that skirt along the walls. They're crushed under huge metal contraptions that serve no other purpose than scraping the walls raw. These thingamajigs of pure suffering, an industry of torture. Damned souls stew in big gravy boats of melted gold. They line the walls as golden statues encased for eternity. Some of them have molten gold spewing out of them like cathedral gargoyles. Like the golden bull idols, they hang as a perverted tribute. Are they all conscious or are they just statues? You don't know for sure, adding to the uneasiness. Greed can be a frustrating level due to its reliance on timed puzzles. I love speedruns, especially speedrun trophies. Mirror's Edge was my jam, but I find myself reluctant to engage when it's a timed segment in a game that doesn't typically have timed mechanics. Like, I love when a game is all about running it quickly, but I get stressed out when a typically chill game suddenly asks you to finish puzzles under a time limit. For that reason, I always found Greed to be way too stressful. Still, Greed makes up for it by introducing one of the coolest enemy concepts in the game, the Hoarder Wasters. These are based on concepts introduced by the original poem, where fictional poet Dante and Virgil first lay their eyes upon the sinners of this layer. The poem's a bit of a mouthful, so to paraphrase, they encounter a huge field full of people shoving boulders at each other. On one side are the Hoarders, people who kept everything and never shared. On the other side are the Wasters, the people who spent recklessly and with little consideration for others. Although this punishment is somewhat mundane, it's my favourite contrapasso because it sets up some interesting implications about hell that I personally choose to believe. It makes swallowing this bitter pill even easier. Are you familiar with the allegory of the long spoons? It's actually a story my dad told me, probably decades ago at this point, but it always stuck with me. Typically involving stew and long spoons, occasionally told with chopsticks and rice, the allegory of long spoons spoons renders hell a self-imposed matter of perspective. In this story, you enter a room and see a long table. Everyone at the table has a small bowl of stew in front of them, and a very long spoon. They can't bend their arms. You see people struggling to eat with the long spoons. They're starving and desperate. No matter what they do, they can't get more than a few drops to stay on the spoon. It spills off before they can bring it to their mouths. When you walk into the next room, you see the same, only everyone is using the long spoons to feed each other. Everyone is satisfied and happy. In this case, hell and heaven become a matter of perspective marked by their denizens. The layout is the same. Both groups have exactly the same resources, only the people of hell are starving because they are the kinds of people who cannot grasp the basic concepts of cooperation, selflessness, and compassion that the people of heaven have mastered. They suffer for eternity on that basis. In Inferno, I began to wonder if the difference between the people of hell and the people of purgatory is that mere shift in attitude. In purgatory, the people suffer, but they suffer penance. They take their punishment knowing that it will better them, no matter how long it takes. Purgatory becomes a vessel for change and growth. I assumed that hell was like a wake-up call. In Inferno, fictional poet Dante makes frequent reference to how ignoble the denizens of hell are. They often curse God and the heavens for what they did to them. When meeting Karen, fictional poet Dante makes a point to describe the bitter entitlement of the souls of the sinners who gnashed their teeth soon as the cruel words they heard, God and their parents they blasphemed, the humankind, the place, the time, the seed that did engender them and give them birth. For me, this sets a scene of a group of people who, despite ending up in hell, still look around and blame everyone else, who still have such little self-awareness that they assume a mistake has been made. Like the guy who comes in last and insta-locks a 5th DPS only to spend the rest of the game screaming for heals, this felt like plain-faced ignorance, stubbornness, and severe main character syndrome. I assumed that upon learning that their punishment was just, they would be allowed up into purgatory and maybe one day heaven, or by taking their long spoon, helping others in hell, and working outside of their own sphere of self-absorbed narcissism, they would earn the right to move on. But I don't think that's the case. The main debunking factor here is that fictional poet Dante asks Virgil, "Does anybody ever get pulled out of here?" And Virgil is like, not really. It's happened to a few people, but it's mainly the big Bible names, and it's only super special cases. He refers to the harrowing of hell, specifically around the time they reach heresy, especially in the game where we can still see the scars from Jesus' arrival plainly, and we will cover that later. But also makes references to one or two other retrievals that occur outside of God's will, emphasis on one or two. So it's pretty clear that coming to understand that you're in hell because you're being punished for your sins, and that taking accountability is all that's required of you to be forgiven by an all-loving father who just wants to see you grow to be worthy of entering the gates of heaven, is nothing but a headcanon. There's nothing whatsoever in Inferno that indicates that the people of greed are forced to throw these boulders at each other day and night. Instead, they charge and batter each other, and fictional poet Dante reports that he can hear them screaming at one another the entire time. There's an impression that they do this by choice, that the supervising demons wandered off to the local center parks for a team-building weekend and forgot to lock up. That said, I don't know how intentional that was.
Is beneath the moon, or ever was, cannot give relief to these weary souls. What a mockery is made of the brief battle for possessions that makes so short a life. You harbor vain thoughts. The undiscerning life that made them foul now makes them dim.
Greed is one of the more involved layers of hell. You end up climbing one end, doubling back over the level, climbing again, and doubling back. If you see something here, you are guaranteed to visit it at one point. The molten gravy boat, the fortune wheel, the statue of Plutus, and while these entities initially appear to be mysterious, intriguing bits of background noise, a tickle of lore to infer, you'll eventually come to understand them and their part to play in Dante's story. First up, we have the statue of Plutus. My favourite depiction of Plutus is the one by Gustave Doré. It's fairly simple, just some naked old dude crouched and devious up on a ledge, but I love how his eyes have been depicted. Now, looking closely, I realise we're likely looking at the whites of his eyes as he cranes to the side to watch Dante and Virgil, but I always assumed his eyes were reflective like a cat. He seemed especially demonic and creepy. In the game, Plutus is just a statue related to a minor puzzle. When the boxes leave the light cast by Plutus, they slowly disintegrate, demonstrating the fleeting nature of wealth, especially wealth earned through the dishonourable methods the presence of Plutus status implies. When you come back later on the back of an Asterian beast, you can toss him in the molten gold. This statue is especially cool because he chants a line you will be familiar with if you're familiar with the poem, Pape Satan Alepe. This line is awesome because no one can agree on what the fuck it means. Some believe it's a prayer, the Pape of Pape Satan in reference to the Latin for emperor or father. There are French interpretations, Flemish interpretations, Hebrew interpretations. It could even be a phonetic spelling of an invocation in a language like Arabic. Is it Alepe in the way that the Italian name Giuseppe is the equivalent of Joseph? So it could be Aleph, meaning number one, or origin in Hebrew. No one knows. How exciting. Lady Fortune's wheel is also a bit of set dressing that later pans out to be something far more interesting in both poem and game, where, despite not being seen directly, Lady Fortune is described in detail by Virgil. Decrees from us concealed, against her naught avails your utmost wisdom. She with foresight plans, judges, and carries on her reign. She is blessed, and for that recks not, rolls on her sphere, and in her bliss exults. TLDR, Lady Fortune is a woman who just loves spinning her wheel. She loves wheel. Wheel is her job. And as her wheel spins, countries and families and companies fall in and out of wealth. She exists to keep balance by moving wealth across humanity, making sure everyone has their fair turn. Virgil remarks that people hate and curse her, but she is literally so happy with her job that she doesn't care. I do wonder why exactly she is in hell, considering what a valuable role she plays and how enthusiastically she plays it, but that's the fate of women in STEM these days. I can't say I'm surprised. Greed tackles Dante's relationship with his father, who serves as the final boss of this level. We see child Dante in a flashback, watching the way his landowner father would take everything from the peasants he ruled over for the sake of excessive feasts for visiting friends. He accuses Dante of being spoiled by his mother and of being useless. By the time Dante finds him, his father is a swollen version of his previous self, with a mouth puckered tight like a booty hole. You have to climb up to him on the back of the Asteri beast as he taunts you with lines like, "You were weak from birth." He's a mess, frankly. A mass of flayed skin, cut open and raw, wounds like the pattern of a Dalmatian on his stretched belly. He's in chains, but still possessing his handy crucifix. Dante's father asks, "You think you're better than me?" To which Dante responds, "I think we're much the same." I love how Dante and his father reflect one another. The magical ability you earn for killing him is called Sins of the Father. The purpose of Dante's relationship here is to see the source of all his sins, but also to outgrow and forgive him. He can't change nor control his father, but Dante will no longer be held down by him. Yes, it's all he knew, but the point of Dante's arc is to understand that he can also know good, and that he can consciously choose to leave his father behind. Although their time together is short and ill elaborated upon, it is cathartic.
I'm not responsible for the man you are. And I will not be damned like you.
Real talk though, I am so intrigued by the implications of the absolve mechanic. You absolve a person and they are automatically sent to heaven, skipping the purgatory queue. They've clearly not learned their lesson, so are their sins just completely removed, stripped away like old wallpaper? But if all they are is their sin, then what happens then? And if absolution is so simple as to just delete all of the badness in a person's soul, why isn't it included as part of the afterlife package? Why are we going to hell when you can just strip someone out like a refurbished car? It's just a lot to consider. Wrath slides in next as the perfect demonstration of how it feels going on a Butlins holiday as an adult. As we wander into this new slice of misery, we see a gaping black sky above us, thick with fog and clouds, and even distant fleeting comets of fire. Although the source of the river Styx is found back up on the surface, canonically, although Virgil hasn't shoved that bit of exposition down our watering gob yet, Dante encounters it here, spewing from the screaming mouth of a cold dead statue. Comets hit the mountainside as we slide down into the depths of rage. Black gnarled roots claw at the brittle walls of this miserable hole. Twisted dead trees writhe across the endless view. Water surges so dark and pitiless that it looks like black paint. Within it we see hands stretching out for help. Boats carrying the damned float listlessly along this forbidden river.
See the souls over whom anger has prevailed. In the warm bath of the sun, they were once hateful. Down here in the black sludge of the river Styx, do they wish they had never been born?
It might seem like Wrath is very short, but it's actually one of the biggest areas in the poem and the game. It's just divided into so many segments that it feels shorter. The Circle of Wrath is depicted faithfully in the game, which also paints a picture of a foggy, cold swamp. Damned souls writhe in the sludge, locked in endless battle. Old rotting stone buildings dot this forest, black gates leer down at you as you pass. Wrath in Dante's Inferno is cold and wet, not hot. Damned souls trapped in the walls scream things like, "I'll rip out your kidneys and feed them to you," as you clamber over them. Platforms sink down into the sludge as you traverse, the grasping hands under the surface of the swamp reaching out to claim you. On theme as ever, Lucifer is his most vocal in Wrath because he is trying to goad Dante into lashing out. He taunts Dante about Beatrice, talks about how he's going to have sex with her, and tries to upset our foolish protagonist. And you're playing like, "Come on Dante mate, it's not worth it, let it go," because you know that Dante of only a few hours ago would have lost himself and been claimed by the swamp. But this new and improved Dante, this man of growth and self-improvement, barely says a word. In fact, Wrath is one of Dante's greatest sins, if not his greatest, and it's here that he's forced to face it head on. In flashbacks we are shown Dante reveling in the violence of the Crusades. Although Francesco tries to remind him that we came to reclaim Holy Land, Dante insists that his sole task here is to kill heretics, demanding to understand why Francesco believes that these heretics are worth a single Christian life. His face turns demonic and he slaughters his prisoners. This part of Wrath is really short, but it's got some of the most impressive visuals in the game. After climbing up another timed fire puzzle elevator, you crest out of this giant tower and see it's draped with 3 enormous rock statues of sinners who raise their heads to the sky and scream, fire billowing from their mouths. They're covered in crosses. This ascent quickly reverses and you find yourself on one of those damned soul boats, crawling along the Styx marsh. Submerged statues scream amidst the black sludge of the marsh covered in weeds like tendrils. Despite their being stationary, there's a huge visual impression of physical struggle. Rivulets of lava run down the distant walls. The camera pans back and forth over this panorama of misery. This is one of the most impactful shots in the game, accompanied by a crawling, scraping soundtrack that haunts your journey through the Styx. Our final damned soul of Wrath Part 1 is Filippo Argenti, Divine Comedy All-Star. Filippo Argenti has the pleasure of injecting the first actual bit of levity into this old creaky poem when he lurches up onto the boat Dante is navigating the Styx with and starts to desperately batter at him in a frenzy. He knows Dante. He was part of the enemy family that had a part to play in his exile and pilfered all his stuff when he was banished from Florence. Dante asks, "Master, him fain would I behold whelmed in these dregs before we quit the lake." Basically, "Can I throw this guy in?" And Virgil says, "I would love for you to be able to do that, but sorry, you can't. It's kind of the point of this place." Filippo is depicted faithfully in his brief in-game encounter, which strikes up a contrast with the game that feels incomplete, glossed over. Game Dante, as far as we know, was not exiled from Florence. He left of his own volition to fight in the Crusades. I suppose Filippo could be referencing an earlier exile that Dante returned from before the game began. Maybe the writers were concerned that changing Filippo's story too much would be disrespectful to the original poem, or might throw up a domino line of other plot holes. Or maybe they just kept it because why not? We all know it's an adaptation. Still, back when I played this, before I read the poem, I wondered who on earth Filippo was talking about. Similar to the Wrath Circle of Hell in the poem, the Wrath Circle in the game is split in two by the city of Dis. Although Dis's placement seems random in the game, it has a very clear purpose in the poem. Although sin is split into 9 circles, poem Virgil explains that these 9 circles occupy 3 categories: sins of incontinence, malice, and brutishness. Lust, gluttony, greed, and that first little bit of wrath occupy incontinence, although I think a more fitting descriptor would be indulgence. Incontinence just sounds like they wee themselves a lot. Although the people of these first sins might harm others in their endless pursuit of self-indulgence, their sins are purely selfish. They're blown around by a lack of control. Dis marks the point at which sins become malicious. All sins are selfish by nature, but malicious sins have the added detail of being specifically about spite. Spiting yourself, spiting others, and spiting God. Depending on the perspective, there's nothing to be gained from the sins within the walls of Dis. These sins are also called obdurate, defined as stubbornly persistent, generally in wrongdoing, refusing to reform or repent. Sins that people felt entitled to commit just to hurt others. The circles of heresy, wrath continued, fraud and treachery are laid out in that order because they become gradually more deceitful, as Virgil describes on their way out of heresy later in the poem, but fraud, because of man's peculiar evil, to God is more displeasing. Fraud, that in every conscience leaves a sting, may be by man employed on one whose trust he wins, or on another who withholds strict confidence. It seems as the latter way broke, but the bond of love which nature makes. Essentially, deceit is such a uniquely man-made evil that it defies the laws of nature created by God. God cannot abide deceit. Fraud and treachery are therefore the furthest from God, and precisely why Lucifer is entombed at the very bottom of hell. All of these sinners are held within the walls of Dis. Dis in the game is the least explored part of the poem, which is a shame. I love Dis because the blokes who work there get the short end of the stick every single time, and I find that so funny. Basically, a legion of demons guard the gates of Dis. They have been told, and they tell this to Dante, that they are never to let anybody in or out. Their only job is to keep the gates closed and to keep the world safe from the armies of sinners within. Beyond them are legions of the worst sinners in human history. If you're guarding people known to be deceptive and some random Italian guy walks up to you like, oh yeah, God said I could be here, obviously you're gonna call bullshit on that. Like, what if it's a test from God? Like secret boss. So they don't let Dante in, or Virgil in. And Virgil starts to get really upset because there's no other way down to the lower circles. And they're sitting there and panicking when this angel comes down from heaven and opens the gates for them. The angel turns to the demons and then says to them like, you have been so insolent that you will suffer 10 times over for this. Like, bro, they are your guardsmen that you control. If you have different orders for them, deliver those different orders. You don't need to threaten them with violence. The angel even says, your Cerberus, if you remember, hence bears still peeled of their hair, his throat and more. Like, the angel literally goes, remember what we did to Cerberus, you're getting 10 times over that for what you did today. Like, no offense, but these boys needed a union yesterday. In the game, Dis serves more as a way to split the experience into two halves. It's a break from the typical methods of level traversal, marked by an extremely memorable series of gameplay sequences. See, your boat is a guy. His name is Phlegethon. If you were wondering why he doesn't make an appearance here, as he does in the original poem, he's actually been present since the moment you set foot in Wrath. As with Karen, I love the way Phlegethon's design has been interpreted to produce more powerful visuals in line with the increasing volume of damned souls. In the poem, he's a tier 3 grumblebee who sails Dante and Virgil across the Styx with only a few lines of semi-interesting dialogue. In the game, Phlegethon is so demonic that he can't even speak. He is an enormous titan of a creature. Unlike with the poem, his assistance feels incidental, like accidentally carrying a woodlouse to work because you don't know it's in your pocket. Dante hops on Phlegethon's head and Phlegethon just goes about his day until he arrives at Dis, where he steps out of the water in another earth-shaking brilliant twist. Firstly, I love Phlegethon's design because we see a ton of similar boats on our travels, meaning he is probably one of many. Secondly, I love that they've kept the eyes of fire from Karen's design, as though it's just a perk of the job when you sign up to be a boatman in hell. Your time in Dis is spent running from gate to gate, fighting crowds of enemies and pulling levers. Phlegethon lumbers around, occasionally blowing fire or stomping with his big meaty fists. I enjoy Dis. I enjoy the way it's designed to look like a bustling demonic metropolis crammed full of strange devil domiciles. I like the way the Phlegethon gameplay splits the game down the middle. I like the classic hell visuals. Still, it is probably the most regrettably sparse area in the game when it comes to the roots of its adaptation. In the poem, Dante meets Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megara. He meets, or rather avoids looking at, Medusa and her harpy friends. And most importantly, he gets the guard demon in a ton of trouble with his boss, a happenstance that is as funny as it is unfortunate. Dante's arrival in the second half of the game is marked by a scene he is forced to witness between Lucifer and Beatrice. Now in some silly buffalo horn dress, and displayed in incredible high definition, Beatrice stands sadly before Dante as Lucifer smugly feels her up, touching her intimately. I really like this cutscene because I think real Dante Alighieri would have liked it too, as it goes hand in hand with his appreciation of Greek mythology. Basically, Lucifer gives Beatrice a pomegranate. As she takes it in her hand, it decays abruptly, like it disappears into smoke and ash, revealing 3 pomegranate seeds. She, clearly knowing they mean bad news, knocks them back, and so begins a curious transformation scene that is communicated through the method of having her spin really fast until suddenly she looks totally different. She becomes her final form, the Queen of Hell, the Devil's consort. This brings with it a total personality change, demonstrated by how she starts sucking Lucifer's face right off. I quite like her design, but I feel as though it's hampered by the graphics of the time. The concept art looks fantastic, this long dress made of twisted, writhing souls, a bodice that is also her actual human skin, arms either covered in sheer black gloves or burnt to a crisp, a body of embers. In the game, she goes from kind of silly looking to kind of vague looking. It's hard to tell what detail of her body is supposed to be what, and that's probably because it's a product of 2010. That said, it might have been better to just go for a design that was better suited to the PlayStation 3's capabilities. This scene is a reference to Hades and Persephone, hence why I think Dante would have appreciated it, although I can't say for sure he'd be happy about Beatrice Portinari no longer being an angelic guide. In Greek myth, Persephone's mother Demeter was extremely protective of her daughter. When Hades asked for her hand in marriage, Demeter said no, so Hades abducted Persephone while she was out picking flowers. Demeter was furious, mainly because Zeus, Persephone's father, yes, Persephone and Zagreus are cousins, kept the truth from her. Demeter was so upset that she abandoned the land, causing immense famine, as she was the goddess of harvest and fertility. Zeus basically said, alright, okay, if Hades can prove that Persephone wants to stay, she can stay. If she wants to leave, she can leave. Hearing of this, Hades, depending on the legend, tricked the miserable Persephone into eating 6 pomegranate seeds, meaning she would have to return for 6 months of every year forever. In the months she returned to Olympus to live with Demeter, spring and summer, Demeter would be so happy that the sun would shine and crops would grow again. Maybe Persephone, the daughter of the goddess of harvest, would know that she had been given underworld pomegranate seeds and ate them anyway because she quite liked Hades, and maybe she was tricked. Maybe she liked Hades and maybe she didn't. Maybe Demeter was controlling and overprotective, and maybe she knew that the men around her were the type to kidnap daughters that weren't freely handed over. Either way, that's the story, and that's what this scene is referencing here. Beatrice has ingested the food of hell, and now she can never leave. That doesn't stop Dante, who fires up the old Phlegethon open-top bus tour through Dis in pursuit. Mr. Graham McTavish nailed the monologue of a lifetime as the camera pans out, and we are forced to behold the mighty walls of Dis in all its monstrosity. Works great as far as my gaming experience goes, but vastly underdeveloped in light of this being an adaptation of an epic poem.
We moved toward the city, secure in our holy cause, and beheld such a fortress. And on every hand I saw a great plain of woe and cruel torment. Bitter tombs were scattered with flame, made to glow all over, hotter than iron need be for any craft. And such dire laments issued forth, as come only from those who are truly wretched, suffering, and forever lost.
Wrath continues in Heresy, which thankfully readjusts the course of this adaptation's quality back on track, with an area that is simultaneously played faithfully and built upon in new and interesting ways. I've mentioned in passing an event called the Harrowing of Hell once before already. Specifically, we hear about the harrowing in the poem and the game when our companion Virgil is explaining to Dante the eye of a needle chance of being allowed out of hell. In this tale, basically, after Jesus was crucified, he walked through the woeful land of hell and extracted many of its hostages. Now, the Harrowing of Hell is an interpretation some have taken from the Bible that suggests that Jesus went down to hell in the 3 days between his death and resurrection and went fucking goblin mode on the place and saved any number of people from his clutches, allowing hordes of previously aimless souls to go to heaven. I speak vaguely here because it's inferred from passages in Peter and Ephesians, but not explicitly stated. Different people have different beliefs on who was saved, if any. If hell was destroyed by Jesus, if he saved everyone, if he saved everyone except the unbaptized, if he saved just a few, or just the Bible patriarchs, or even if it's just an allegory for the collapse of the eternity of death itself. It can get very cosmological in some discussions, and I'm speaking vaguely here because I'm not Christian and I'm describing this as an outside viewer looking in. That said, the Harrowing of Hell is referenced in the poem and the game. What I love about the way the harrowing is represented in both is that, remember way back when I talked about how much Dante values the concept of legacy. Dante is massive on people having value. Although Limbo is a place of quiet peace, there's a special cordoned off area just for the special people like Aristotle and Plato. It's argued that Dante included Emperor Frederick II in Heresy above anyone else that was on the table because A, he disagreed with his beliefs, he waged war against 2 popes, and the entire Catholic Church, yes, and he was excommunicated 3 times, yes, and he was a major player in the conflict that saw Dante exiled from Florence, yes, but it's also believed, and my source is the 1978 book Reason and Society in the Middle Ages by Alexander Murray, that Dante despised him specifically for suggesting that nobility was the result of a lucky birth, being born into wealth. Dante hated the idea that the world was anything except a meritocracy, because without value, what is our legacy? Every damned soul Dante speaks to in the poem begs to have their story told on Earth, or Dante offers to tell their story when he returns. All of them. The only wish of the damned is to be remembered in Dante's world. To him, there was no greater fear than the idea that he might one day be forgotten, so it's very lucky that he was a good poet. And this speaks volumes about his choice on who is name-dropped during the harrowing. When Virgil explains the harrowing to Dante, he lists the big names that were pulled out. In Canto 4, Virgil tells us that Jesus fetched Adam and Eve, Abraham, Noah, Cain and Abel, Moses, David, Israel, Rachel, and a few others. Without a lasting earthly legacy, why would Jesus see you as valuable enough to take to heaven? Dante even says, "For well I knew suspended in limbo many a soul of mighty worth." In the poem, Dis and the Eighth Circle fraud still bear the scars of the harrowing. The walls of Dis are crumbling and the bridges that join the Malebolges of fraud are entirely destroyed in some areas. This is taken to greater extremes in the game, which takes Dante's reasonably brief time in the Circle of Heresy as an opportunity to add a bit more flavour to the idea. As with all other layers of hell, Dante enters Heresy with a classic wall-swinging section. As with all the other layers, this wall-swinging segment is mechanically simplistic to allow the level to load in the background, but visually tailored to the miserable space we're about to bear witness to. The contrapasso for heathens is sophisticated in its plainness. They are stuffed into coffins that constantly burn with eternal fire. As we learn in Inferno, it's not one soul per coffin, it's crowds in places. Specifically, the arch-heretics are here, accompanied by every sect of their followers, and much more than thou believest. Tombs are freighted, like with like is buried, and in the monuments are different degrees of heat. Essentially, there's a coffin per sect of heretics, so you're all stuffed in together. The more heretical the sect, the hotter the coffin burns. Poem Dante notices that no one bothers to guard the coffins, despite the lids being off. Everyone just lies in the burning coffins, unsupervised, waiting for Judgment Day, when the lids will close and everyone will have their bodies back and the torture will be unimaginable. This is more or less the depiction in the game too. Coffins burn eternally. Some of them alternate the flame, mechanically, to serve as an obstacle for the player, but in the case of world building, to depict a torture where the only contrast one's soul would know is the brief moment of relief between agonizing burning. It creates this fantastic effect whereby the sound of screaming feels as though it's moving, like when a roller coaster rages by you. Walls are lined with people who never understood that this would be a consequence of not believing in God. The place is littered with crucifix statues of Jesus. Reminders. Visually, this might make for a fairly simple level, just eternal halls lined with blokes in burning coffins, so Dante's Inferno adds a few layers to this place with only a sprinkle of extra world-building detail. Firstly, this becomes the area of the game most affected by the harrowing of hell. It's visibly wrecked, and beams of godly light pour down from the heavens to literally destroy aspects of the geography, opening new ways for you to move further down. Dis is wrecked, yeah, but it's no heresy, which feels like it's still undergoing this monumental cataclysm.
Down and take forth from here a group of ancient shades. The deep, foul valley trembled on all sides, and I thought the universe felt love.
Secondly, by adding a cool new enemy variant. The heretics and pagans are really good inclusions because they are explicitly warlocks who ran heretic sects in early Christianity. They're not big enough to even be mini-bosses, they're just greater enemies with a resistance to magic attacks, but so much effort has been made to ensure that they weren't just a cool new enemy type. Their background specifically feeds into how they're intended to be played against and how they can buff other enemies, and I really like that, even if they're a pain in the arse to fight. Pagans and heretics look similar, but there's a slight difference in how they play. Specifically, heretics have this ability where they can cast a ward that makes them, and any nearby enemies, immune to the magic of Dante's crucifix, demonstrating how they turn other people away from the true god. Obviously, this isn't in the poem, so there's not much to compare there, but I liked the implications of a ward spell that actually works against a holy item. It's never specifically explained why, obviously, so it's up to the player to interpret it. The obvious mechanic-related answer is because it's a good way to add complexity to combat without being Doom Marauder level obtuse, but it still adds implications to matters. After all, all of it, I think I basically came to conclude that Dante's holy relic is tainted by his own impurity and his lack of personal commitment to God. The heretics are heretical, but they're priests, so they're pure in their commitment even if it's to the wrong god or belief. So they trump Dante even if direct intervention from the Almighty would trump them. The pagans explicitly worshipped fake deities like Baal, adding intriguing connotations to Lucifer's prior comments that the people of Saladin were in their hell, not Dante's. Unfortunately, while I would love to read loads into this, I still think it's just a storytelling inconsistency based on a short-sighted intention to look cool, and I think it harmed more than it helped. These enemies speak Enochian. Enochian is a real language, so to speak, in the sense that it's occult constructed, not native to any particular people or country, but is in our real world. One of the men who invented it, John Dee, insisted it was the language of angels, and claimed that Adam himself, of Adam and Eve, no, not today's sponsor, the other one, spoke it. It was believed that speaking the language of angels would allow clear communication with God and his legions. Consequently, the heretics and pagans speak Enochian when casting spells, invoking the name of the gods they'd worship. Spells would come in the form of single-word invocations: Owadriax, Taoagla, Ponadol, and such like. Heresy has a ton of flavour in the poem, not so much in the geography but in the implications. Despite it being a relatively short stay and arguably one of the lesser relevant sins in Dante's story, Heresy is one of the most interesting sections of Inferno because it demonstrates so much about Dante's attitudes towards heresy and his attitudes towards individual heretics. We could spend all day dissecting who he chooses to include, who he doesn't explicitly include, why, and what that means for our eccentric author. Heresy could be a video all on its own, and regrettably it won't be. Dante's depiction of heresy isn't so much unusual as who he chooses to put there. Dante was extremely proud of his piety as a Catholic, even if that pride feels ironic. With that, you'd expect him to have a few specific heretics in mind. Although heresy could be considered a fairly private sin, the early Christian church has a few big names when it comes to heresy, a few all-star heretics he could easily have drawn upon when writing this section of the poem. To massively oversimplify a few examples for the sake of time, and to remind you to look into this yourself if you want fuller and more accurate explanations, we have things like Marcionism, a movement based on the belief that the Old Testament God was evil and not the God associated with Jesus. There was Montanism, which basically looked to the Holy Spirit as an autonomous force who would bestow followers of Montanus with prophetic visions. There was Valentinianism, named for its founder Valentinus, who probed the idea that much of the Old Testament was allegory, not literal factual stories, and that God himself was a superficial image of God, not an actual instance of godhood.
In this part of hell, Epicurus, with all his followers who make the soul die with the body, have their burial place.
Either way, it doesn't matter, because we see neither hide nor hair of these people in the poem or the game. Instead, real Dante Alighieri included 3 souls we meet directly on our travels. Emperor Frederick II, who we've discussed, a bloke named Farinata, named for his blonde hair, so we can safely assume his nickname was essentially Blondie, and the father of real Dante's real-life friend, named Cavalcante G. Cavalcanti. All of these people are featured here as damned souls. There are no boss fights, only a simple but long-winded traverse, reverse, traverse puzzle that has you move a statue so that you can escape. Heresy is probably one of the most interesting circles of hell because of how telling it is about the nuance of Dante's personal religious beliefs and how he judged the people around him. Dante's Inferno adapts this exactly as it was written and doesn't seek to expand on anything that might be a misinterpretation of real Dante Alighieri's opinions. Instead, it expands on the world Alighieri wrote by adapting it to a video game in a way that preserved the original author's vision while making heresy extremely fun to toss around in. Yes, this level could have been far more detailed, but Dante's Inferno took the concepts presented in the original poem and ran a mile with them. Dante skips out the back door and returns to Wrath as we know it, all gnarled, twisted roots and foggy black skies. In situations where the game wants to honour a part of the poem they likely lacked the time, scope or resources to include fully, it tends to resort to statues. We'll see a lot of statues from here on out of characters too big to not qualify for inclusion in the game's adaptation, but also not important enough to game Dante's story to feature as NPCs or bosses. One such creature is the Minotaur, a statue I never realised was the Minotaur the first few times I played this game. When I read the poem, I was like, oh shit, it's the Minotaur. In Canto 12 of Inferno, Dante and Virgil are scaling down from heresy into the Circle of Wrath when the Minotaur pulls up on them and starts freaking out. Virgil sarcastically goes, "Do we look like Theseus to you?" And this freak gets so upset that he bites himself and runs off in a rage. I guess the Minotaur is a bit overdone in terms of enemy design. Maybe there's some boss fight on the cutting room floor, maybe not. But quite frankly, I didn't play Dante's Inferno for that first time like, wow, this is really missing some brood of bull and Cretan queen 3 stars. A lot of games have Minotaurs and Minotaur-adjacent creatures, such as best game of all time Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and I don't think the inclusion of one here would have blown my socks off. No, the Minotaur works great as an awesome bit of set design, a tasty bit of visual depth, and a cool way to continue traversing the wall bits that connect each layer. We meet Attila the Hun here too. I already mentioned him. I just thought you'd like to know. As far as sinners go, Attila is pretty up there on the list of evil. After people like Chaco and Francesca de Polenta, Attila is here to notify us that we are now in the big leagues. Naturally, I absolve him though, because if I absolve a man of sins and allow him entry to heaven, then I'm not so much forgiving them as I am literally just stripping them from his soul, which means he is technically completely without sin, and he doesn't have to repent actually, and maybe this doesn't really make that much sense. I'm ashamed to admit that this game rendered me a firm atheist more because I'm ashamed to admit that I saw the absolution of sin played out as a quick time event in a 2010 video game made by the Dead Space people, and assumed that's how it would work if it did happen. After a short chain-breaking segment, we arrive in one of the most iconic areas of Middle Ages hell, the Phlegethon, the river of boiling blood. And yes, it looks exactly how you'd expect.
In violence, wounds and death are inflicted against one's neighbors. This ring torments those who murder and plunder, and every soul who wrongfully smites another.
We find more statues here, specifically the statues of 3 centaurs: Chiron, who taught Achilles, a bloke called Nessus, and Pholus, who Virgil remarks is prone to wrath. Lucky that. In the poem, Virgil asks for help getting past the river, but it's phrased in a way where it reads like he's asking for uppies, which comes off so funny considering the circumstances. In Inferno, the Phlegethon has its wrathful sinners submerged at different depths depending on their severity of violence, with a troop of centaurs on hand to fire arrows at anyone who dares creep too high above their assigned levels. There aren't really any arrow-firing ranged enemies in this game, and those mechanics probably wouldn't work so well, so instead this segment is adapted as a huge set of cages and furnace platforms. The cages are held aloft by the centaur statues and sink into the burning blood under Dante's weight. The furnace platforms sit on their backs, blowing alternating fire as you battle various winged demons. Overall, this section is memorable, faithful, while adapted well for a video game, and a distinctly mechanically unique part of Dante's Inferno. And from good to great, we head into the Forest of Suicides. The Suicide Woods is one of the most divisive parts of this 800-year-old poem, written entirely off the back of one man's personal opinion about the application of his theology. See, suicide wasn't considered a sin by the church until, at the earliest, the 4th century. The first Christian to publicly denounce suicide as a sin was St. Augustine, in the 4th century, who believed it to be a form of murder. The act of suicide became immersed in shame and fear, remaining so for the next 9 decades. Thomas Aquinas, who was alive at the same time as Dante Alighieri, vilified suicide as an act against God and denounced suicide as a sin for which one could not repent. Aquinas' admonition resulted in civil and criminal laws to discourage suicide. As a lover of ancient Greece, it's likely Dante could have also been influenced by Socrates himself, especially since Socrates features in his writing, because Socrates believed that human beings were the property of the gods and did not have the right to take away something, namely life, that did not belong to them. Ironically, he was accused of impiety and forced to take his own life by drinking hemlock. Even though most early civilizations viewed suicide as a means of escaping an unbearable existence or of releasing loved ones from the burden associated with caring for the sick or elderly, Dante wrote Inferno at a time when the religious institutions of the Western world firmly opposed suicide on multiple grounds. They considered it literal Judas behavior, because he hung himself, and assumed guilt by association. In Europe specifically, it was considered to be depriving one's lord of their possession, which is fucking bleak, and it violated the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as it's technically self-murder. Now, controversial as this may be, but I do get the impression that Dante was a bit snobby and a bit simpy. Despite his lifelong grudge over being booted from Florence, I personally think he was a bit of a bootlicker. He heavily favoured the big names of ancient Greece. He thought that he would become nobility if he just worked hard enough and proved himself enough, and although he writes his poem Dante as being flawed with pride, I don't feel like he possessed the self-awareness to understand that he was extremely proud, and he was so proud that he never even scratched the surface of grasping just how proud he was. To me, Dante's inclusion in the Forest of Suicides is really exciting in a proper meta kind of way. You never get the impression that he thinks these souls deserve to be here. Some people have suggested that. I didn't get that impression. Fictional Dante is pretty horrified at everything that happens in hell, honestly, and he doesn't speak on his own feelings as to whether someone who kills themselves deserves to then suffer forever. What's interesting about this depiction, rather, is the fact that he even chose to include it in the first place. It demonstrates so much about his personal theology, who who he believes and what he believes, that his rendition of hell even features a special corner for people who kill themselves. This isn't in the Bible. This aspect of sin is purely man-made. In fact, down here, Dante meets a damned soul named Pietro della Vigna, who served Emperor Frederick II, yes, the very same, from the Circle of Heresy, and to very briefly summarise his background, Pietro made a few blunders when in service of Frederick as a lawyer and diplomat. When an assassination attempt against the Emperor failed, Pietro was blamed and imprisoned. His eyes were gouged out. When he decided he'd had enough of being disgraced, Pietro killed himself by smashing his own head open on the prison cell walls. In Inferno, Pietro insists to Dante, "Never faith I broke to my liege lord, who merited such honour." Dante Alighieri could have chosen anyone as his token suicide example, but he chose Pietro, and in doing so framed Pietro's suicide around how he affected his lord. I think that's so telling. It's indicative of Dante's attitudes towards people and property, and how, probably even without realising, he implicitly places this earthly appreciation of the sin of suicide over anything that could instead be considered an affront to God. Pietro is here because he gave up on absolving himself for his lord, and took away his lord's right to enact justice against him, and now he will never be absolved. The game adaptation takes a far more sympathetic attitude towards victims of suicide, despite still placing them there in honour of the original poem, and because the concept of the Forest of Suicides is, sorry Pietro, absolutely sick. It's brilliant. No offense. In the Forest of Suicides, people who have killed themselves are denied their mortal form in death. Instead, they're turned into trees. In Inferno, these sinners can only speak while they're bleeding, as Dante learns by accident. Virgil's like, "Go on, snap a twig on that tree, see what happens, go on, you'll love it." And Dante does, and the tree is like, "Ow, Jesus, why did you do that?" It's all very peep show. As soon as the bleeding stops and the tree heals again, they can no longer speak. This is to signify how they could only communicate by harming themselves in life. The people of this circle are the only shades that won't receive their bodies back on Judgment Day. Their bodies will instead hang from their branches, so they're forced to look at them forever. No, this does not reflect my own opinions on people who kill themselves. I'm just talking about the poem.
One may lay violent hands upon oneself, and therefore in this place, those who deprived themselves of their lives repent in vain.
Visually, the Forest of Suicides in Dante's Inferno is much the same, but those extra intricacies would be difficult to be adapted for a video game, and so are replaced with something more gameplay friendly. Thankfully, this is no twig snap simulator. In Dante's Inferno, the trees remain, but they bear suicide fruit. Human-sized, red, hanging fruits that drop into combat, open, and emit like a suicide beam. If Dante steps into it while fighting the legions of hell, he will kill himself. The concept reminds me a lot of the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, based on the poem by the same name by Abel Meeropol. The song is about the lynchings of African American people, likening them to strange fruit hanging from trees. Visually, the Forest of Suicide seems to have taken a lot of inspiration from that concept. There are also sinners here called profligates, who self-destruct in life without destroying the body, by destroying their money and possessions, to the point of suicide. There's a hairline between them and the wasters of greed, but I've yet to put my finger on where exactly that is. It also takes one very special person from Dante's past and places her front and centre. While there are problems with that depiction that we'll get into, I think giving Dante someone he knows personally as a victim of suicide is a fantastic way to overcome the fact that suicide is typically still really stigmatised. Of all the sins, it's definitely the one that people get the most indignant about and the most victim-blamey for. It's the hardest one to empathise with if you've never been in that place, and the easiest one to project your own insecurities onto, so people tend to view suicide with very little empathy and compassion. Not to say you should kill yourself, but it's better to treat people nicely than get angry at them for it. When Dante encounters his mother here, it's a twist that flies in out of nowhere. As you approach her, Lucifer will say things like, "As your friend, Dante, I'm telling you, you're not ready for this." And you'll be thinking, who? Is the twist going to be that Beatrice had actually killed herself? I don't know any women in this game besides her and Cleopatra. Who is it? And after a short combat segment, Dante's mother drops from the bough of a tree, panicked eyes staring into the distance, limbs limp and gnarled and turned to wood. She utters the same "have you no pity" as Pietro in the poem when Dante unknowingly snaps a twig off his body. Dante is distraught, announcing that he believed his mother died of fever. Virgil, as always, fails to read the room.
Mother, no.
When the soul quits a body from which it has uprooted itself, Minos judges it to the 7th circle. There, it sprouts, shoots up like a sapling. No body, only the pain. For it is unjust that any soul possess that of which it has robbed itself.
Dante's mother's inclusion in this story is a shame because she's neglected by the story in ways that Dante's father and Francesco are not. We know so little about her that we don't even know to expect her here by the time we arrive, and her speech to Dante feels redundant because it's stuff he needed to hear after he's already had his character arc.
I despised your father's cruelty, but I was too weak to defy him, and so I took my own life. And you learned his ways.
Forgive me.
The fault is mine. I had not the courage to protect you. Can you forgive me?
I should have. Mother, why did I lose everything?
Some men change, son. Others become the man they once were, the man they wish to be.
Beatrice was all I had. Why did I betray her?
It is too late for us, son. There is still time for her.
Dante absolves her and moves on, and the irony of Bella is in just how easy she is to forget. Finally, we move on to violence to the deity, which Virgil defines as by denying him in the heart. Now, this may or may not be the booty sex circle. I'm being reductive, honestly, but it's 30% true. The burning sands are home to three kinds of sinners: people who commit violence against nature, sodomites; people who commit violence against order, usurers; and people who commit violence directly against God, blasphemers. Unlike the prior subsections of violence, this one just seems to be where the miscellaneous violent people go. All the other subsections have some sort of consistent theme, but here they have people who do butt stuff seated and suffering next to some guys who lended money at unreasonably high rates of interest, and some other people who said Jesus Christ when their mum got on their nerves. And those three are as inequivalent as they are just really not that sinny. Sorry, Jesus. Well, usury sucks, but who among us hasn't treated themselves to a good old for God's sake? One thing I will compliment this area on, however, is how it takes the concept from the poem and elevates it, forging an area that brings us right back to Dante and his origin. In the poem, these shades are forced to either sit, walk, or lie under eternal rains of fire. This place is so dangerous that Dante has to walk along a particular border path so as to see the shades within and chat to them without getting horribly burned. If we're not counting the Malabulges of Fraud, which Dante literally cannot physically access, then this is the only part of hell that is too dangerous for Dante to walk through properly. Here he meets his prior mentor in game and poem, Brunetto Latini, who was known for his anal proclivities. And by that, I don't mean he was tidy. Brunetto's presence here feels a shame when we compare him to all of Dante's ancient Greek idols who get to chill up in Limbo and be one of the greats. Brunetto's presence here is intended to serve to remind us that no one is safe from God's wrath, that everyone is judged equally even when in a story written by Dante, his charge. Brunetto's presence in hell supposedly demonstrates Dante's impartial judgment, how no one gets off easy just because he liked them, but no one is safe until Dante's favourites might technically qualify for heresy or even sodomy, Socrates and Plato being two unconfirmed but definite potential inhabitants. Because then he has to write a nice safe area for them to take shelter in. And before you say they're in limbo because they didn't know God, remember that Semiramis lived in 900 BC and Boudica was born and died hundreds of years before Christianity reached England, so it's absolutely one rule for me and another for thee. It's a bit of a boys' club. Sorry, I just feel like Brunetto has done kind of dirty here, and Semiramis, and Boudica. In the game, this circle of hell becomes extra cool and extra memorable when we begin to traverse it and realise we are in some ruined alternative Acre. It's a wide desert reaching as far as the eye can see, but it's dotted with Crusade-era ruins, architecture and ships. They serve as brief reprieve from the unending rain of fire, save this place from being a massive sandpit, and bring us right back into Dante's story, a reminder of who he was, how far he's come, and how his life looked from the perspective of the people trapped in hell for exactly the same sins. Maybe this is where Dante would have ended up had he not qualified for wrath or greed or lust, because this is where we find Francesco. Presumably down here for blasphemy and not for a quickie behind the bins at Oceana Swansea, Francesco is the final boss of violence. Maybe he's just here because it spaces things out and does literally allow for him to serve as a final boss, but who knows. Either way, it's time to bury the hatchet, quite literally because he's furious and he wants Dante to die and suffer alongside him.
Francesco, my brother.
You did this to me!
Wait, listen!
You don't deserve to be my sister's slave, let alone her lord. Now pay for what you have done!
Francesco, no!
Francesco's design is brilliant. His back is littered with swords, symbolising the way Dante betrayed him by allowing him to take the rap for his own actions, getting his brother-in-law and closest friend hanged with barely a tickle of remorse. His body is twisted painfully like bark. He wears armour of bone, and between it we just see raw, flayed sinew, like his skin has been removed and he's been left to traipse through the sands. Imagine getting sand in your raw muscle. We fight Francesco against a backdrop of the Phlegethon, now waterfall, a visual depiction of all the blood spilled for the sake of these two men. As the fight concludes, Dante doesn't so much wait for forgiveness as he does basically just apologise and send him up to heaven. He doesn't need forgiveness now, and he doesn't want it. He just seeks to do right by his brother.
Our deeds were done in the name of God. Why is he forsaken us?
In the name of God? Murder is only in the name of the murderer.
Redeem yourself, brother. Use my soul wisely. Beatrice. Sister.
Fraud is accessed on Gerion's back. In the poem, Gerion is a real dude, the embodiment of fraud itself, a creature with a man's face, lion's paws, a wyvern's body, and a scorpion's tail. This living metaphor for a visage of trust backed by a horrible reality, waiting to strike when you're least expecting it. Dante is terrified, almost to the point of it becoming prime comedy. He is pissing his pants, he can barely move. After everything he's seen in the wretched realm so far, it's Gerion that freaks him out beyond coherence. My favourite depiction of Gerion is the one in the book by Acre Games, which gave me a much better frame of reference for how this guy could be so terrifying. Gerion does have the face of an old man, yes, but it's monstrous, grinning, and enormous. It's almost wet with slime, ghastly, pale, and ghoulish. In other depictions, he just looks like the kind of guy you see in the pub at 10:30 AM on a Sunday morning. After a brisk pep talk from Virgil, Dante pulls himself together enough so that he at least appears brave and climbs on Gerion's back. He compares the feeling of dread to how Icarus must have felt when he realised the wax was melting. Really funny stuff. In Dante's Inferno, Gerion is a statue you could easily mistake for Atlas, carrying Dante and Virgil down the Phlegethon on his back. A huge shame, but maybe they were running out of money. Fraud is one of the most controversial aspects of this adaptation because it strips out more than it adds and frames this section of the game around 10 challenge rooms. I don't mind this, quite honestly. At this point we've been doing anywhere between 5 to 10 hours of the same kind of jumping, combat, basic puzzle gameplay, and giving you 20 minutes of challenge rooms really breaks up the flow. For me, I found that those latter subsections of violence got lost in all the noise, so I can hardly imagine how much I'd be glazing over during 10 Malabulges of Fraud, especially since, let's be real, some of those Malabulges are very boring. Although Fraud in the original poem follows more exploration of Dante and Virgil, including a run-in with some demons they have to flee lest they go in the pot with the rest of the shades, Fraud in the game is all about Dante's relationship with Beatrice. She's now acting as Hell Queen Consort for real, so she has full command of all the demon legions here.
Manacoda, show our guest his eternal resting place.
The Malabulges are structured into individual arenas that are reached through elevator rides and bridges. The arenas are just huge hanging plates of rock above bottomless black abysses. At the bottom of those abysses, further than you can see, are the Malabulges. There are 10 Malabulges, 10 trials, and therefore 10 rooms. In every room, Beatrice has some passive-aggressive remark to make about how each one relates to the way Dante or his cohorts have behaved, just to hammer home how much Dante really deserves to be here. It's also done in the self-indulgent way of an ex who has absolutely had enough of your behaviour and is now just listing off everything they don't like about you. Dante was in pieces by the time he got to the Bolgia, specifically for people who leave clothes in the washing machine for days until they get smelly and you have to do them again. As with Dis and Heresy, this place has seen better days. After the harrowing, chains are snapping and platforms are crumbling. One elevator is on the fritz. The damned souls just sit quietly in corridors between Malabulges, presumably waiting for their Uber ride down below. And that's all there is to this place, hence why it was pretty panned. That said, if you're still here, I know it's because you love hearing about all the awesome details of hell, so I'll talk a little bit about what we missed from the poem just for you. Unlike Wrath, which has sublevels with definitive borders between them, like you walk into entirely different environments every time you reach a new sublevel, Fraud is one big level with 10 distinct trenches inside it. Sometimes this is depicted as one big flat plane with 10 trenches, and sometimes this is depicted as a layer of hell full of levels like steps, and in each step is a Bolgia. A Bolgia is kind of like a moat. It's a deep, deep trench in the earth that's so perfectly dug bug out that it appears man-made. In each of the 10 trenches are 10 different kinds of sinners, each equating to each of the 10 forms Dante believed fraud could take, and each with a grim contrapasso. In the poem, the trenches seem shallow enough that Dante and Virgil can make light conversation with the shades, but I actually prefer the way it's presented in Dante's Inferno, even if it means I lose out on seeing awesome, gross and creepy stuff. I like the fact that each Bolgia in the game is a bottomless pit, and the screams of the suffering are just barely audible below. I like the idea that if I shone a torch down there, I'd see some struggling distant figures. Different smells would emanate up. It would feel like a vast empty prison of pure blackness rather than some little street with some sinners toddling around on it. So the first Bolgia of fraud is dedicated to panderers and seducers. Panderer meant something slightly different in Dante's context, as opposed to today where one might consider a panderer to be someone who panders to someone else, basically A-grade simping. It's not always assumed they'll get something in return. In Dante's context, a panderer was someone who did such but explicitly with a desire to get something back. Dante meets a guy here who pimped out his own sister, for example. Seducers were similar. They would fluff other people up just to meet their own sexual desires. Jason, of Fleece, is here because Dante despised his nasty habit of chatting women up, getting them pregnant, and then abandoning them. Panderers and seducers each used people for their own needs, but in slightly different ways. Accordingly, they must walk in opposite directions as they're flogged by demons for eternity, and if that doesn't ensure you get your steps in, what will? The second Bolgia is for flatterers, who are now as physically full of shit as they were figuratively in life. The trench is just full of poop. I like the idea of it magically just seeping from the walls, filling the place up for eternity, but never quite enough that the damned souls are ever having to tread water in it. Dante comments on the wall of smell that smacks him beak first as he encounters the place, and one of the damned he speaks to has so much shit caked to his head that he looks like a lollipop. Lollipoop. It's a lot to unpack here, but again we see that kind of Dante logic that frustrated me when it came to Semiramis, Boudica and Brunetto, 2 women and a man who did anal. We meet a woman called Thais here, labelled in the game as Thais the Harlot. I did a bit of research into here because I was like, damn, that is quite a nickname. How many kings and nobles did she sleep with and betray to wind up down here? And truthfully, there are a lot of conflicting accounts on who she was, or if she was even real, yet the reason Dante gives for her being down here is that her lover gifted her a slave, and she replied with so much flattery that her gratitude was beyond believing. I was like, Dante, what do you want, man? The game renders it a ton more understandable as to why she would be here, since it states explicitly that she seduced hundreds of men into killing for her. Still, I couldn't actually find any historical evidence of that. I don't know if they just added details to her story for the sake of making it a more reasonable contrapasso, or if they found something I didn't. You can find a translated version of the story of Thais the Harlot online, and I'll link it below, which suggests she was just a beautiful prostitute that men would sell everything and kill each other just to be able to pay for her time, which sheds further light on her just kind of doing her job and getting blamed for the behaviour of others. Other stories report she went on to become a saint, but when I read them it basically just seems like some local priest took her to a monastery and abused her by locking her in a cell for 3 years that she even had to piss in, verbally abusing and belittling her through the crack in the door, and then she literally died. But if she became a saint, why would she be down in hell? All I'm saying is, I think this woman could do with a retrial. Sorry, Thais, you might have gotten off more lightly if you wrote ancient Greek poetry. The third Bolgia is for Simonists, who Beatrice comments Dante followed so blindly. And she's right. Simonists were essentially, basically, people who used their positions in the church for financial gain. Specifically, they would sell ecclesiastical favours, spiritual office, and sacred items. Their contrapasso is clearly one Dante put a lot of thought into. If you read about this Bolgia on cliffnotes.com, you'll see a pretty clear parallel drawn explicitly with baptism. Cliffnotes explains, the Simonists are upside down in holes resembling baptismal fonts, illustrating that their sin debased their office, and their feet are on fire, most likely lit by the oil of the last rites. Their time in the font is limited, however. When a new sinner comes, he takes the previous sinner's place, and the previous sinner is shoved down into the rock for eternity, much like the succession of Simonists in office. These sinners are punished in a manner that is a curious reversal of baptismal practices of the time. Even the burning feet are from the oil used in baptism instead of the cool sweetness of holy water. Dante hates these kinds of people, and the wider corruption of the church, so much that he specifically stops to shout at the sinners here. Specifically, Pope Nicholas III. Some have used this to argue that he becomes more judgmental of the damned as he moves down through hell, that he basically starts to be like, no, you should be here, and starts to take an unquestioning attitude towards God's decisions. I don't think this is the case, but rather he just hates these guys in particular so much that he stops to lecture them. And it was this attitude that actually moulded that headcanon I I mentioned previously about hell being a place you stay in until you realise you're here for a reason and truly repent, at which point you're allowed into purgatory. I thought that Dante was frustrated with the sin here because none of these souls are ever actually sorry for what they've done, and he tells them they deserve to be here because he wants them to understand that they do. This is no admin error, and the sooner they apologise and take accountability, the sooner they'll be out of here. Like, I would be really frustrated if I saw all these people cursing everyone else, blaming everyone else, refusing to take responsibility, acting like they're here by mistake, when all they needed to do was effectively say sorry. Unfortunately, I think that's just a headcanon. Nothing in the poem indicates that repentance will do anything for you, so Dante's lecture here is just that, a lecture. Only there are no more lessons to learn. The shade is already here. Bolgia 4 is for the fortune tellers, people who tried to see the future, which only God is allowed to do. For their punishment, their heads are twisted back and they cry as they're forced to shuffle around the Bolgia. It's not specified whether they cry because this punishment is so painful, or if they cry as part of their contrapasso, making their vision so blurred that they can't even see the present. Looking at this really upsets Dante though, like it's one of the most horrifying things he has personally seen in hell. It really gets him, so I always got the impression that it was more the former. Down here they meet a very interesting individual named Tiresias, who we are told transformed into a woman. Tiresias is here because she was a fortune teller, obviously, but the emphasis is on her gender. Now, this is really interesting. Tiresias is depicted in the Dante's Inferno game as a woman. Being a woman meant Tiresias could be an oracle, someone who saw the future, and being a man meant Tiresias could be an augur, like that bloke from the Mages College in Skyrim. Having access to both genders allowed Tiresias to access the full range of divination techniques. I think Tiresias' story is allegorical and not to be taken literally. I've seen people argue Tiresias was turned into a woman by magic and it wasn't her choice, therefore she's not technically trans, and not to be a killjoy, but I don't believe magic exists. Tiresias really enjoyed living as a woman for many reasons. Apparently the sex was better, and in some stories she also had children. I would definitely take this to be an allegory for trans, non-binary, or generally genderqueer expression. I don't have much to say about Tiresias beyond the fact that she is here, and there's a whole video worth of things we could discuss about her, but we don't have time. I just thought you'd like another rabbit hole to go down, so to speak, if you wanted to learn more about her. Bolgia 5, fantastically, is reserved for corrupt politicians. Thank the Lord. Praise be. Why has the ticket price from King's Cross to my hometown gone from £33 to £58 in less than 12 months? Why won't anyone do anything about it? Why are you banning ninja swords? Why are we so fucked? Tell Malakoda to give me 5 minutes with these guys. I've got some questions to ask. Let me have a go with the pokey stick. Anyway, the politicians here are kept in boiling black pitch, which is like black hot glue. It's a little bit like tar. The Bolgia is full of it, and the politicians are floating face down, but they're so covered in it that Dante struggles to see them at first. Occasionally one will pop their head out just to do this big gasping ragged breath for air, quickly popping back down before the demons patrolling the place prod them back in. Also, the last line of this canto implies the demons sound a horn to their leader by farting, which is crazy. Bolgia 6 is for hypocrites. They're forced to wear lead-lined cloaks and march around the Bolgia forever. There are some blokes underfoot who are crucified to the floor and they get trampled constantly, and Virgil's like, oh, they weren't here last time I was here, which made me laugh. The idea behind these cloaks is that, like a hypocrite, they look marvellous and perfect from the outside, but are weighted down on the inside. Like when people bang on about grooming and then turn out to be groomers, the idea is that their actions are performative, but their insides are full of sin. Bolgia 7 is for thieves, who are constantly assailed by snakes who bite them over and over again. I believe every sinner is a snake, and to become a person again, they need to bite other people, to steal their forms, so to speak. The snake bites are like lucky dips of special effects, causing things like instant combustion, or even painful, miserable transformations into snakes themselves. This whole circle seems like unending chaos as people run and scream from snakes for eternity. Bolgia 8 is for evil counselors and false advisors who are kept in discrete individual flames, just burning away like the flame on the tip of a match. Bolgia 9 is for sowers of discord, who have this fantastically gory concept whereby they are forced to walk around the Bolgia, but every time they pass this one demon in his chop shop, he'll lean over and slice them in half in some horrible way. It feels almost like an assembly line, or holding out a tray in a cafeteria and just getting a big dollop of vague food dropped onto it. I can only imagine a demon in an apron with a little axe, slashing people wide open and telling them to move on. Some are headless, some are split down the middle and forced to walk as their insides splatter all over the floor, some have limbs removed. The idea is that they caused schisms in life, so they suffer the same physically in death. Finally, Bolgia 10 is for the falsifiers. Beatrice calls them society's plague. These people have every single illness all at once. Dante remarks that this is the loudest Bolgia in Fraud. The sound is so offensively loud that it makes him jump when he crests the hillside to see it. I guess it was previously dampened by the cliff edge. These people are in so much miserable pain that they cannot move. One guy even comments that he hates some man over there, and he will shuffle over to deck him one, even if it takes him 100 years. After beating the 10 trials of fraud, Dante faces a very angry Beatrice.
Beatrice, stop this. I have faced all my sins, and I am ready to take you home.
All your sins? I think not. Look into the 9th circle of hell. Look into the dark, cold realm of the traitors.
Unlike every other damned soul in hell, Dante has learned his lesson.
You condemned my brother to death for your crime! What is your answer for this treachery?
No. I give up on this journey. My place is here in hell. Yours is in paradise. I am truly sorry for what I have done. May you one day forgive me.
Handing over his ward against evil, returning the crucifix to his beloved, Dante breaks through her righteous anger. She sees, for the first time in his life, that he is sorry. This breaks the spell on her by Lucifer. She turns back into a happy, naked Holy Ghost, and gets zipped up to heaven. An angel appears here to reassure Dante that he's doing great and to notify him that he has an important part to play in a story that's just begun. No one told him this wasn't going to get a sequel, I suppose, and fucks off. Dante is ready to follow Beatrice himself, but he has one last loose end to tie up first. Reflecting the icy hearts of its inhabitants and the worst possible position on our Earth being the furthest possible distance from God, the centre of Earth and the lowest level of hell itself is ice cold. Treachery is a sin purely of man's creation, so God hates it the most. It goes against the natural order. For one to be a traitor, they need to assume that they have right and authority enough over the person they betray, and an entitlement to try to rise above them, at their victim's expense. Satan, who can be found here, is the greatest example of this, considering he believed he deserved God's power. This final circle is surrounded by chained giants. Dante takes one look at these fellas and literally thanks nature that they're no longer produced, which is quite rude. These giants are simultaneously characters from myth, but also represent individual sins. Nimrod is here, the builder of the Tower of Babel. Since the construction of the tower was prevented by everyone randomly suddenly speaking different languages, Nimrod just sits and babbles nonsense in the ice. He can't be understood, and he also can't understand anyone else. He represents pride. Ephialtes, son of Neptune, is down here for warring with the gods. One arm is bound in front of him and one behind, holding him super securely. He is Wrath. There's another guy here who also seems to represent Wrath, so maybe it's just like 1 pride and 6 wraths. Who knows? As we climb down into Treachery, we encounter the faces of these giants embedded into the ice walls. They blow freezing air at Dante as he scales past them, but otherwise are not hostile. No specific giant is named for us, so we don't know which one we're skipping past at any one time. One of them has arrows embedded in his eyes, rendering him blind. They add this tragic grandeur to the place, like you're walking amongst unfathomably mighty caverns as ancient winds of pure ice gust around your feet, and Dante's chest tapestry gets all frosty. Treachery is very loosely split into 4 sections, but the differences are only in how much of a sinner's body is submerged in ice. Again, we get a fantastic insight into Dante's own personal politics surrounding servitude and nobility. The outermost circle is called Cana, after Cain from the Bible, who killed his younger brother Abel in a jealous rage. This circle is for people who betrayed family and are frozen up to their necks in ice. There's a shade here who demands Dante watch where he's walking, and Dante just boots him in the face in this uncharacteristic act of spite. Next is Antenora, named for the Trojan general Antenor who betrayed his country to the Greek army. This is for those who betray their country. The ice reaches their jaws here, so they can't even bend their necks. There's a shade here called Count Ugolino. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I literally couldn't find a pronunciation guide anywhere. But he is probably one of the most famous shades in the entire poem and could have an entire video written about him too. All we learn about Count Ugolino is that the man whose head he is eternally chewing on nailed him in a prison cell with his sons until they died of starvation. He cannibalized them with their pre-mortem permission and then died of starvation himself. In the poem he says, "The fasting got the mastery of grief," i.e. hunger did what grief could not. There's this statue of Count Ugolino that I think, but correct me on this, is available as part of the Underworld collection in the Musée Rodin in Paris. His sons are all grasping off him, one of them is already dead at his feet, and in his face you can see this immense, unmistakable dread. See the way he grasps at his face and cheeks, his fingers drawing rivulets in his own skin. He, the father, can see what has befallen them, but the boys still look to him and cling to him. It's an immensely detailed piece, and if you've ever seen it in the flesh, know that I quiver with jealous rage. Anyway, I'm sure you're asking, how could a man like that ever be expected to wind up in hell? Well, Count Ugolino was a member of the religious faction that rivaled Dante, but they shared significant family ties, and Dante is very sympathetic towards him in this poem. When we meet Count Ugolino down here in the game, we get a new perspective. Italian nobleman and naval commander. Aligning himself with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines alike, he switched allegiances often until his ultimate imprisonment and death by starvation. See, Count Ugolino isn't in hell for eating his sons, although that's the story that Dante chooses to tell about him when we meet him. He's actually in hell because he was the epitome of I play both sides and that way I always come out on top, and repeatedly betrayed both sides of the faction war in Florence. He got a lot of people killed just to maintain whatever earthly power he fancied. Eventually, after just running rampant through Pisa and the rest, he was captured and flung into the cell with his sons and grandsons and left to die. If it's any consolation, scientific examination of the remains of this family disproved any assumptions of cannibalism. It seems he just died of starvation with the rest of them. The third circle of treachery is called Ptolemaea, named for Ptolemy. Ptolemy invited his father-in-law and two brother-in-laws to a banquet and killed them. This circle is reserved for people who betray their guests including anyone taking shelter in your home. These people are laid flat with only their faces visible. When they cry, their tears freeze and they can no longer open their eyes. The final, centermost circle is called Judeca, named as such for the Judas Iscariot. Yes, the betrayer of Jesus Christ. This, the worst and most evil place in hell, is for those who betrayed their lords and masters. Once again, betraying Dante's attitude towards authority in comparison to family or country. Everyone here is totally frozen in the ice in painful positions, so Dante can't speak to them. I always found this detail really eerie. Imagine the silence, just the whistling gusts around you, millions of people stuck in the ice at your feet, as you silently wander through to the main event. These circles aren't present in the game, or if they are, it's too subtle to tell from a glance. What the game does have, however, is the bridge. For some obscure reason, the final bridge before the final boss of this game is to be taken on tiptoes as the loudest, most intense orchestra blasts in this poor little crusader's ears. For the first and only time in the game, Dante must shuffle delicately across sheets of ice that will fall at a moment's notice. And it takes like 3 minutes, and the music is insane. I laughed the whole way across the bridge, it's ridiculous. I suppose you could call it a treacherous bridge. Haha, 10 out of 10 level design. Anyway. There's no bigger stakes in all of gaming than this boss fight, taking place on a fantastically lit icy pentagram. Facing down against literal Lucifer, Dante's got the balance of heaven and hell in his hairy hands. See, the chains we've been destroying on our trip down from the surface were called the Chains of Judeca, and Lucifer is in Judeca, and he's supposed to be chained up. By luring Dante down here, he has played right into Satan's plan for freedom.
You are the best, Dante. Many have tried, and many have failed me. Brave Ulysses, the great Alexander, Attila, Lancelot. Only you possess the soul black enough to free me.
Lucifer's boss fight is split into 2 stages. There's the big fight against huge poem-accurate Lucifer with 3 heads crying blood as his frigid wings cast bone-chilling gusts across the battlefield. And then there's the Lucifer's stomach opens up and he climbs out and fights you man-on-man half of the fight. The main detail you'll notice is the size of his knob, which is absolutely heinous. Biblical girth master. This guy is hung like a Pringles can and Dante's not looking for any sour cream. I suppose this mammoth cock is intended to take attention away from the fact that this fight plays a little too similarly to the demons you fought throughout the game. He's got more attacks, don't get me wrong, but his skeleton is still the same and he moves the same. It's thematically on point, like they're all fallen angels, so obviously he would look like them, but mechanically underwhelming. And no, we don't see Judas, which sucks. As we fight Lucifer, he screams things like, "I was supposed to bow to humans?" demonstrating how his punishment has, again, taught him absolutely nothing. Rather than taking his time out like a man, Satan sat and sulked and got himself in a tizzy, and now will attempt to do exactly what he tried to do in the first place, only with a track record record that reflects poorly on his odds of success. See, it turns out that victory was inside Dante all along, because Dante had the ability to change and grow. Dante learned all of his lessons as he travelled through hell, faced all of his sins head on, and took accountability for the harm he did to others. He was forgiven by his friends and family. He helped them ascend to heaven even when he knew he didn't deserve to be there himself, and never expected to be allowed there himself. Lucifer stewed for thousands of years with a stick up his arse. Dante proves that they are not the same.
Not yet. I have collected many souls on this pilgrimage. Souls that I have freed from this inferno. And together, they now possess the power to free me. Father, mother, brothers, absolve me!
With the power of friendship, Dante smites the demon lord, sealing him back into the lake. Better luck next time, Lucy. Maybe another few thousand years will give you the opportunity for self-reflection that you clearly need before you're allowed back up with the big dogs. The sun sets here on Dante emerging from hell, having followed the river Lethe all the way up to the surface and the foot of the earthly mountain of purgatory. He is nude. He rips his tapestry off his chest and drops it to the floor, where it turns into a snake, revealing Satan did indeed escape with him after all. As Dante gazes up at purgatory with a hopeful smile on his face, we realise that the story has barely begun. And then the sequel got cancelled. It's important to recognise that you'll never have a one-to-one adaptation of the Divine Comedy. Not only did real poet Dante write in Italian, but he wrote in Middle Ages Italian. There are so many hurdles involved in translating that. The output isn't going to be written in a vacuum. Every reader will have different interpretations, no matter how minor. If you're adapting a work, you can fill it with notes and addendums on how you choose to translate it. If you've ever read fan-translated manga, you're probably familiar with that style of translation, because it's transparent, and it allows you to understand moments that might be more up to interpretation, moments that you might disagree on the translator with. Still, that's a comic, and this is a poem. To be clear, I won't claim to know shit about poems, so I'll keep it brief, but it's important that I pretend to when I explain. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in terza rima, a rhyming verse form composed of 3-line stanzas with a 3-line rhyme scheme structured ABA, BCB, CDC. The main relevance of this is that you have two choices when translating Inferno. You can try and keep it as close to that as possible, even if you can't manage the same rhyming scheme. You can do verses in lines of 3 with similar rhythms, or you can just shout out the translation exactly, even if the result is clunky and way too long. If you don't want a translation littered with notes and asterisks and addendums, you want to keep it somewhat close to the structure of the original poem. So let's use an example. The word awe, as in shock and awe, or awesome. Awe, today, means amazement. Something awesome is something fantastic, brilliant, and exciting. Back then, it meant fear, terror, and great reverence. The difference isn't enormous, but it can change a sentence pretty fundamentally depending on how it's employed. Again, this is only an example to illustrate my point, not a specific example from the Divine Comedy. If I was reading something to translate it into English and I encountered a sentence that meant I faced an awesome entity, or I faced an entity that was awesome, or the entity before me was awesome, the entity before me was awe-inspiring, filled me with awe, an entity of awe. If I was translating something along those lines and the output could be any combination of those sentences, I have a choice on which word I might choose. I could say awesome, but that's contextually confusing. I might have to include a note to specify whether I intend the contemporary meaning of awesome. And if I have to make this choice every few paragraphs, I'm going to have a translation full of notes, so it's best that I choose a translation and commit to it. The version of the poem I own was translated by the Reverend Henry Cary, who died in 1844. Being a reverend, we can assume he was a God-fearing man, and many of his descriptions may have skewed in the direction of emphasizing godly omnipotence. He also published his translation of the Divine Comedy at his own expense, so we know this is a man who invested a lot in making this poem accessible, had immense respect for Dante Alighieri, and cared more about imparting the translation than he did about monetary gain. The Reverend Henry might use words like miraculous, terrific, divine, tremendous, or terrifying, emphasizing the divinity of the situation, the spirituality, the omnipotence and terror of God. The intention is to educate, but the author's bias is one that leans towards divine obedience. Federico Corradino and Silvia Baroncelli, author and illustrator of Dante's Inferno for kids and curious parents, are writing from a place of national pride. I can relate. I'm from Nottingham, and I get very excited at any mention of Robin Hood. I'm ride or die for Robin Hood. As both proud fellow Florence dwellers and with a focus on teaching children about the epic Divine Comedy, these two would gravitate towards simple language and seek to emphasize how impressive each of Dante's feats are. These authors might use words like wonderful, amazing, or incredible, words that children will understand and words that quote-unquote curious parents might be be more comfortable with explaining. The emphasis is on educating children without scaring them, and they lean positively towards Dante himself. The author of the simplified and modernized version of the Divine Comedy identifies only as B&S books. There's no author credited besides Dante himself. This author makes it explicit that they want to create a version of the Divine Comedy that can be consumed by anyone, with an emphasis on neurodivergent folks and people with dyslexia and similar issues that might hinder engagement with the original text. Consequently, this translation will be more likely to use modern and simple terms. They also forego the 3-line rhyming scheme and tell the story plainly. This author might use terms like impressive, staggering, wondrous, spectacular, a lexicon still intended for adults, but as a vessel for the clearest possible understanding of the scene as it unfolds. The aim of this book is to make Inferno extremely accessible. Still, it might lean too neutrally and end up downplaying the sentiment of scenes, so it's give and take. The Inferno translation produced by Acre Games is supplementary to their gritty D&D campaign. It's full of horror-esque, gory representations of the antics Dante bears witness to across the course of his journey through hell. Acre Games is from Italy, everyone who worked on it is Italian, so you have a crew of people who don't need to run Dante's work through 2 layers of translation to understand it. That said, when it comes to depictions, they may naturally skew their translation more towards spectacle. They're selling a grisly D&D campaign at the end of the day. They want to make something really cool. They hired a bunch of super talented artists. The focus is on creating memorable visuals. They might use words like awful, formidable, fearsome. The intention is to entertain, to set a scene for a group of tabletop RPG players. Every adaptation is going to be different. If there was such a thing as a correct way to adapt Inferno and the Divine Comedy, we will never know what it is without input from the original author. And what was the author adapting to? Dante takes great liberties with stories from ancient Greece, world history, and the Bible itself. Should we honour their original stories in their forms, or play it the way that Dante played it? One of my favourite debates surrounding the original Inferno poem is whether it's technically proto-fanfiction, some 700 years before that term existed. This exists on somewhat of a bell curve. On the lower left end we have, yes, it's fanfiction, derisive, and it slopes up centrally to, no, it's not fanfiction, and then it dips into the lower right end with, yes, it's fanfiction, complimentary. Honestly, there isn't an answer to this. I'm really sorry. I know there's a temptation in YouTube video essays to expect solid answers, but in historical studies we simply do not have solid answers. It's hard to put into words how little information we actually have about the past. By the time it gets to a history book, it's usually such a complete impression that you would assume we get chunks of exposition handed to us in large records, like we just have archives of historical fact littered around the place. In reality, historical fact is taken from thousands of primary sources being things like letters, paintings, a diary entry, if you're lucky, legal records, shipping manifestos, and will have any number of gaps. This isn't Assassin's Creed Valhalla. People weren't announcing everything in writing. People don't tend to write down the obvious stuff. And when it comes to debating whether or not this poem is fanfiction, we are working off extremely subjective opinions that litter the spectrum of historical debate. We are also working off a gulf of time, debating a piece of work from an era we will never truly understand to fluency. There's no uniform agreement on what exactly fanfiction is. Depending on how we alter the exact definition of fanfiction, we will get different answers. For fanfiction to exist, does the thing you're writing need to have a fan base, or do you just need to be a fan of it? I feel like the latter is true. Fanfiction as a term is like 20 years old, but it would have existed before, we just didn't have a word for it. Is it too modern to be applicable to old poems, or is it just me gatekeeping poems that are old because they are too noble and old to be described in modern day terms? We could argue that Dante couldn't be making fanfiction of Christianity, considering that to him, Christianity was the truth, not fiction. So does that make it historical fiction? But if I write fanfiction about One Direction, something I know not to be fictional, it's still fanfiction. But if I waited 100 years and wrote a fanfiction about One Direction, would it no longer be fanfiction? When does something stop classifying as fanfiction and start to classify as historical fiction? Moreover, could the same be said of fictional characters that Dante knew were fictional, like Medusa and Semiramis, even if he places them in a non-fiction world? If I write a story about the cast of Hades going to an American high school, even if that high school is like my high school, is it fanfiction? There are multiple versions of Queen Hecuba of Troy in Greek mythology, where she is taken as a slave with the rest of the women of Troy after it is sacked. In only one single version does she go insane, becoming angry like a rabid dog, and that's the version of her story Dante chose to acknowledge. If I write a story about Pocahontas where she survives her visit to the UK and goes on to live a long and happy life, is that fanfiction? What about if I don't believe Christian theology is real? Or if Dante is only accurate to some of it? If he changes or invents the literal workings of the Christian God to do things that align with his personal beliefs? Is that fanfiction? Was it fanfiction of Greek mythology instead? Greek mythology has its own fandom wiki, but then again, the countries have their own fandom wiki. Dante Alighieri was certainly a fan of Virgil. Is it fanfiction of Virgil to have them run into each other, have Virgil introduce Dante to all of his clever mates, and have those clever mates compliment Dante and how cool he is? If I write a story about going into the Greek underworld and Jesus Christ is there for some reason, and he's hanging out in Elysium, and he tells me that he loves my YouTube videos, is that fanfiction? And is Dante a self-insert if he literally writes himself into this journey as the main character? While his journey is fictional, it's arguable that this is an autobiography told through allegory. But if I wrote myself into the world of Transformers, even if it was an allegorical autobiography, is it fanfiction? Probably. And that would make me a self-insert. Is Dante immune to these kinds of observations because he wrote a poem that is old, and fanfiction is young and immature and trivial, just a silly genre for teenage girls, and therefore immune to the slander of such a label? And if Dante's Inferno is fanfiction, that would render a lot of historical fiction fanfiction. Is that okay? Is it okay to bundle a ton of old stories into that same category? And, I mean, how much do you even care? In my opinion, yes, this poem is fanfiction. To me, it ticks every deeply subjective box I have of what exactly fanfiction is. If you said to me, I don't agree with you, I don't think I'd lose any time trying to change your mind. My broader belief is, I don't care, but if I had to say, then I think it's probably fanfiction. When I voiced an interest in covering Dante's Inferno, I got a comment asking me if I planned to discuss the women, specifically Beatrice. Initially, I had no plans to. I'm only 29 years old, but still, I grew up during the noughties. By this point, I've seen enough eras of sexism in film, games, and media to know how I feel about it. Anything sub 2015 at least has the propensity to make me roll my eyes, especially with games. If I want to sit down and critique something, I will, but these days I've learned to pick my battles. Nowadays, I turn those antennae off and just engage with things on my own terms, knowing that they are sexist, but knowing that I will get very irritated for no reason if I decide to be annoyed by that. There's a time and place, and getting pissed off by myself in my bedroom doesn't do much besides render me tired and grumpy. When I decided to cover Dante's Inferno, I did it with the knowledge in the back of my mind that, as with a lot of games of that era, it is not especially respectful about women. It was so normalised to me that I had basically forgotten it was there. It was something in my peripheral vision that I never focused on. It's a game from 15 years ago. Obviously the women of the Inferno will exist to have their tits out and little else, even if those tits spray tiny zombie babies all over the battlefield. It's like thinking about the depth of space. If I let myself focus on it, I will go insane. Still, I think I have a responsibility to cover it, and so I will. Be aware that what I'm going to talk about isn't coming from anger. I've made peace with it, but it's worthwhile highlighting and unpacking, so we'll do that here. In the Divine Comedy, how you judge Beatrice's implementation is up to your discretion. Basically, real poet Dante met a girl called Beatrice Portinari when they were both about 10 years old, and again when they were both around 19 years old, and then never again. She died in her mid-20s, likely during childbirth, and while married to another man. When Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, at around 35 years old, he used Beatrice as the angelic messenger that sent Virgil to lead him through hell. All the characters talk about how she is a beautiful, perfect, and divine creature, a vision that brings tears to one's eyes. Some people have understandably interpreted this in a creepy way, and some people have interpreted it in an innocent way. Beatrice may have been a creepy obsession, but she also may have been a muse in the most literal original definition. In Greek mythology, muses were goddesses of inspiration. Nowadays, we use muse to refer to people, typically women, who inspire us. You might know your muse, but your muse may also be a romantic ideal. It's possible that Dante didn't love Beatrice, but instead fixated on her because he didn't know her. It's easy to idolize someone you don't know, because you don't have to know all the things you wouldn't like about them. There are many assumptions we can make, but no concrete answers. I can be convinced either way, honestly, but I don't know the truth, and so I don't feel like I can make a judgment on it for sure. In Dante's Inferno, the game, some effort is made to rebalance their dynamic. Game Dante and Beatrice are similarly aged and happily married. Game Beatrice is an extremely godly woman, they're engaged sexually, they live together. Any questions about predatory notions are eliminated. And that's the writer's prerogative, quite frankly. I don't mind this adaptation, I wouldn't care if they'd attempted something more accurate to history either, but maybe they didn't feel comfortable making certain assumptions about Dante. The problem with Game Beatrice lies in everything else about her. There is not a single shot in the game, outside of some of the animated cartoon flashbacks, including her literal dead, murdered corpse, where she does not have her tits fully out, like 100% topless. When writing this video, I rewatched a playthrough via MK Ice and Fire's channel, and they go to insane pains to censor every cutscene she's in, because there's not a single shot I would consider YouTube friendly. Even when she is being attacked by an assassin who has just murdered Dante's father in front of her, running for her life, screaming and crying, he grabs her dress and rips it away like crepe paper, just to make sure that she is still topless. It's exhausting. Secondly, her characterization. Beatrice is godly, loyal, and obedient. That's not inherently an issue. The issue is that that's all she is. She stupidly gambles her soul on Dante's loyalty in exchange for his safe passage home, and he cheats on her the moment it's proposed. He is very happy to shag around. When she appears to Dante as a spirit, all she can do is meekly say things like, "I'm sorry, Dante, I have to go with him. I gave him my word." Looking woefully at the floor, eyes full of tears, tits prominently out. Lucifer traces her jawline with his finger, fondles her, kisses her, leads her to some big hell bed. There's a difference between "I swore my soul to Lucifer" and "I swore my coochie to Lucifer," quite frankly, and her utter lack of resistance in their exchanges, so willingly going to bed with him that she seems more shy than anything, renders her firmly an object. In Dante's Inferno, Beatrice is a fleshlight that Lucifer steals, and Dante goes to retrieve. At the midpoint of the game, she is given a pomegranate by Satan. It dissolves into 3 seeds, which she reluctantly but obediently eats. As we discussed, this is an intentional callback to the story of Hades and Persephone. In the game, Beatrice eats the seeds and becomes an evil version of Beatrice, because she is red and angry. At this point, she begins to enact revenge on Dante, taunting him from afar, making him undergo trials, making him sorry. This is the only point in her arc where she has any depth to her, and it's also the point of her character arc where she becomes most pitiful. She is being puppeted by Lucifer in a bid to escape from hell, just some pawn in his ultimate plan of emancipation. But she thinks he's going to take care of her now. While her step into villainy gives her the most dialogue, the most motivation, and the most intrigue she may ever have been granted across the course of the game ever, it comes at the cost of seeing her used. But hey, at least they're not kissing with tongs now because she is simply an object to be passed by. Oh, gross. Next on the list is Cleopatra, a historical figure mentioned only by name in the poem. Cleopatra is 2/3 of the final boss of the lust level of hell in Dante's Inferno, the other third being Mark Antony. She is sex incarnate, wearing a highly sexualized version of her pharaoh garb. She's basically naked, and instead of nipples, she has mouths on her breasts that spit out angry hell babies with scythes for hands who attack you. She sends Mark Antony out to fight for her. She keeps him in her throat, obviously. When Dante smites Mark Antony, Cleopatra returns to her human size and approaches him, movement reminiscent of a snake. Her death scene is... Can we let this poor woman rest? Poor Cleopatra. Rounding off the 3 I don't know how to write women female archetypes of the virgin maiden Beatrice, the malicious whore Cleopatra, we have the mother. Dante's mother, Bella. Her part to play in the story is arguably the smallest of all 3 women. Having killed herself over Dante's father's treatment, Bella now hangs pitifully in the Forest of Suicides. Her place here serves as a reveal to both us and Dante, who has been told she died of an illness. After a short conversation about how sorry she was not to be stronger for him, Bella is absolved and sent to heaven. Bella is a shame because she wilts as a forgettable footnote in Dante's story, ironically monstrously overshadowed by Dante's father, who dominates the first half of the game. She died because Dante's father was too mean, but her absence isn't depicted as one of the many factors in Dante's slippery slope into acts of evil. It's never implied that her being there would have changed his trajectory, even if she might say she wishes she was stronger for him. These days when I look back on kind of slightly older media and I see the sexism in it, I kind of just take it because I know that things are getting better, and I'm reassured by the fact that a Dante's Inferno of today wouldn't be the same as the Dante's Inferno of 2010. Yeah, Dante's Inferno was pretty sexist. Yeah. It is a shame. Yeah, if I let it bother me, I think it really would bother me. Yes, I still think this game is a masterpiece. The ending of Dante's Inferno implies that we are about to climb the mighty mountain of purgatory, and likely follow the events of the second third of the Divine Comedy, Purgatorio. Dante's little tapestry falls off him and becomes a snake that slithers away, laughing and foreshadowing the return of Lucifer. It's all set up for the story to continue, but it never does. I'm sure there were financial reasons for this. EA, especially in those few years, had a penchant for either cancelling great series or shitting all over their original premise. Dead Space became a brightly lit shooter in the snow because that's what the kids like these days, and then it got cancelled, and that was made by the same developer as Dante's Inferno, so our little historical game had no chance. That said, I never could see a good sequel coming of this. Inferno feels like an early blown load, quite frankly. Paradiso is very impressive. The poem continues to have merit, like it's definitely worth a read all the way to the end, but as far as gaming adaptations go, you've definitely spunked the coolest material right at the beginning. Purgatory especially is just hell light. It's an earthly mountain where souls are pretty okay about the penance they have to perform, and their penance isn't a fraction of the punishment of hell, so I'm not really sure what you'd do with that. Imagine if the first few hours of Doom were the fantastic demon-crushing fun you've come come to expect from the series, and then Doomguy just goes for a walk for a while. It would be funny, it would be great in an unexpected way, but hardly quality gaming. Paradiso had the propensity to be quite an epic game, especially if you leaned in the same direction as some of Doom Eternal's DLCs, which took the concept of heaven and pivoted slightly to create a visually fantastic world full of enemies that was still very much hostile to you. But then you run the risk of being deeply offensive to Christianity, which isn't off the table for me, but likely would have been off the table for a company like EA, who dug in their heels at the thought of alienating anyone. So basically, it would probably be crap, and EA never would have let them try anyway.